Chapter 3397. Her back was against the door, and the man in front of her was like a beast. "Surely, give me the documents," he coaxed her patiently. In fact, he was not angry. Work was endless, but she had just come back. She hadn't had this kind of fun for a long time. She held the documents stubbornly. "No." She bit her lip and stared at him. "If you continue to work like this, I will leave and not take care of you." These were childish words again. Mullen was annoyed and amused at the same time. He reached out and gently pinched her face. "Then tell me, if I don't work, will you accompany me?" She opened her eyes wide and looked at him. He took away the documents in her arms and threw them aside. He reached out and picked her up. "Accompany me to take a nap." She was a little messy in his arms. He was a patient. Wasn't he a little too strong? Besides, she was taking care of him, not sleeping with him. However, he was very strong. He carried her to the bed and didn't let her move. This was the first time they slept on the same bed after so many days. They didn't take off their clothes and slept together under the quilt. Baishuali didn't want to sleep with him, but her stomach felt warm and comfortable after eating. She fell asleep in his arms after a while. She slept soundly. Mullen didn't fall asleep. He looked down at the little thing in his arms and smiled. She was taking care of a patient like this. It was more like being taken care of. He closed his eyes. There were always so many things to do, so he slept with her peacefully. These days she ate and slept well, but he didn't have a good sleep. At this time he felt very comfortable holding her and slept well. When he woke up, it was already dark, and the light in the ward was dim. If it weren't for the smell of medicine, he would have thought that they were on the big bed in his apartment. Mullen woke up. When he opened his eyes, he saw her black and bright eyes looking at him in the dim light. "Mullen, I'm hungry." He felt a little funny. "What else can you do besides eating?" She didn't say anything. In fact, she could do a lot of things in the past. All kinds of parties, but she had no money now. She could do nothing but eat. She leaned against his chest and whispered, "You said you would provide food and shelter." He propped himself up, turned on the light, and stared at her. "Your care is just for food and shelter?" She also sat up slowly. "What else can I do?" He was furious. "Can't you have some dreams? Like saving me or redeeming me?" "I'm not a doctor," she whispered. "Besides, why should I get you back? It's all your fault. I've already decided not to like you." Mullen felt that he was asking for it. Even if he wasn't sick, he would be sick from being angered by her. He stared at her for a long time before asking, "Do you want me to die that much? You were the one who said that I wouldn't be able to live for long, and I had no choice." She said in an infuriating tone, "No one cares if I live or die. So, why should I care about your life or death?" Mullen asked softly, "Are these your true feelings?" She hung her head and said nothing, but tears fell from her eyes. It was obvious that he did not mean what he said. Mullen did not expose her. He reached out and pinched her little face. "I'll cook for you." Chapter 3398. She moved closer, closer, until she was almost on his shoulder, and she did not know it. Mullen glanced at her. "Idiot," Baishuali snorted, but she was still interested in this. "How do you do it?" Mullen finished ordering the dishes and slowly put away his phone. "You need to go to Matewan and bind your bank card to it. But the prerequisite is that you have a bank card. Do you have one? Oh, you also need to have money in your card." No matter how stupid Baishuali was, she knew that she was being mocked and looked down upon by him. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Don't cry." Tears welled up in her eyes for a long time. Then she snorted. "You're not here anymore. These are all my inheritance." Mullen was angered by her again. He lifted the quilt with a livid face and looked at the suitcase at the door. "Hurry up and dry it." Baishuali threw away her pride and face for a bite of food. She ran over and opened the suitcase. Then she bit her lip. "The clothes have changed." He walked over and looked down at the poor little dog. "You don't know how to wash them?" She squatted there. "No." He really doubted how she survived these days and how Lin Cece was willing to tolerate her. He reached out and pinched her little face. You haven't improved at all. He was about to pull her suitcase when Bai Shuili suddenly hugged him. She hugged him tightly and stubbornly. She said softly, Yi Mulin, don't die, okay? His heart suddenly softened. What's wrong? Didn't you want to share my inheritance just now? Why are you reluctant to let me die now? She didn't say anything and just buried her face in his chest. She didn't want to admit that she couldn't bear to leave him. What she was willing to admit to him was that she couldn't bear to let him die. She couldn't accept it. Really, she didn't want to go back to his side, but she couldn't leave him alone. Yi Mulin seemed to understand her as she hugged him shamelessly. He let her hug him and slowly hugged her too. He thought he still understood her, but he didn't say it out loud. He just hugged her. He helped her wash the clothes, taught her how to wash them, and taught her how to dry them well and wear them as if they were new. He taught her a lot, but she hugged him and cried very sadly. Actually, since she knew that he was going to die today, she had cried many times. She was afraid. She was afraid that the man she hated would die. She was afraid that, if he really died, she wouldn't even have the chance to hate him. Yi Mulin reached out and patted her. We still need to check. It's not certain that he will die. Look at how scared you are. She froze for a moment and then lowered her eyes. If you have nothing else, I'll leave. He smiled and said nothing. At this moment, the delivery man came over. The young nurses at the door were whispering to each other. This ward cost 10,000 a night. Lawyer Yi was really using it to the extreme. She was using it as a hotel. Yi Mulin brought the dishes in and went to the kitchen to cook. She was watching by his side. She said that he would teach her and that she could cook for him in the future. He knew in his heart that all of this was built on the foundation of his illness. So this illness of his couldn't be cured. He had to think of a long-term illness that couldn't be cured, but couldn't be killed. They hadn't eaten together for a long time, so he made a few home-cooked dishes that tasted great. Bai Shuili was watching from the side. She wanted to help but was rejected by him. He hesitated for a moment. Let me do it. He reached for her hand. Chapter 33:99. He cooked and ate with her. He was also the one who washed the dishes. Finally, Rice Worm was somewhat enlightened. He asked uneasily, Yi Mulin, should I do something? He looked at her and thought for a while. Help me take a shower. In order not to give her a chance to refuse, he walked into the bathroom while saying that. Bai Shuili came back to her senses and ran in. You can take a shower yourself? But she closed her eyes as soon as she opened the door. His clothes had actually disappeared, and he was so energetic. He didn't look like a patient at all. Yi Mulin said lightly, I have to save my strength. Why do you want to save your strength? She put down her hands and bit her lips. His gaze seemed to be a little fixed. He looked at her for a long time and then said, Bai Shuili, don't you know? She thought of the things on the bed, so she leaned against the wall. You shouldn't think about this kind of thing, and I don't want to. When she said these words, she didn't feel very confident. He laughed. Bai Shuili, do you think I want to have sex with you? Her eyes stared at him, and then she looked down. His body showed that it had been a minute, but he still had such a big interest in this kind of thing. Come here. His voice was hoarse. I'm talking about work. He stood under the water, closed his eyes and said softly, Those work were done in the past. People should have the spirit of a contract. After saying that for a long time, she didn't say anything. He opened his eyes and looked at her, then said softly, Come here. She still walked over slowly and took the shower gel to help him clean, one after another. He closed his eyes in enjoyment, and then said in a low voice, And below. He was a little careless and he was a little dissatisfied, but he didn't say anything. He stood straight and let her clean his body, put on the bathrobe, and fulfill the spirit of the contract. He left, and Rice Worm found that her clothes were a little wet, so she thought about it and took a shower. But she didn't have clothes to change, so she poked her head out and found that Yi Mulin wasn't in the ward. He should be in the study. So she went out carefully with the bath towel wrapped around her waist. found one of his shirts and put it on. She wanted to wait for the clothes to dry and then wear it secretly. But she was so sleepy that she fell asleep as soon as she laid down on the bed. Yi Mulin was busy all the way until it was almost 12 o'clock before he returned to the ward. As soon as he entered, he saw that the person who had promised to take care of him was comfortably nestled in the bed, sleeping soundly. The room was dark, and she was lying there quietly. He couldn't help but take 2 steps forward, and then he realized that she was wearing his shirt. His heart skipped a beat, and he sat down to watch her. He wore a white shirt casually, with the top 2 buttons unbuttoned. From his position, he could see a glimpse of spring. His Adam's apple bobbed uncontrollably, which was extremely sexy in the dim light. He put his hand on her shoulder. After a moment of hesitation, he pushed her away. "You're sleeping like a pig." She woke up, rubbed her eyes, and looked at him in a daze. Yi Mulin. His slender fingers caressed her neck. "Why are you wearing my shirt?" She immediately sat up and thought for a moment. "I don't have any clothes to wear." His fingers were still hovering over the button, and he let out a low laugh. "This is my dress. I have to take it back." After saying that, he moved his hands and feet. Originally, he didn't have such a plan, and he wanted to slow down. But she was dressed like this, waiting for him on the bed. If he didn't do anything, he wouldn't be a man. Chapter 3400. Bai Shueli's nose was red. She looked at him in the dim light. "Yi Mulin, I don't want to." He lowered his head and kissed her. His voice was hoarse. "Didn't you say that I needed 1 minute? Now I'll show you whether it's 1 minute or not. Okay?" Lawyer Yi was a man of his word. Many minutes turned into 1 night. The next morning, Mama Yi came over. She got the news that her son was hospitalized. As a father, he didn't have to come, but as a mother, she had to come. Yi Mubai also came with her. As soon as Yi Mubai saw Bai Shueli lying on the bed of the eldest son of the Yi family, he touched his nose and knew everything. Mama Yi asked the accompanying servants to wait outside and walked over to see the situation. Her sick son was in good spirits. He was leaning against the bed and reading documents. His little wife, who hadn't seen her for a long time, was sleeping soundly on one side with a tired face. Mama Yi knew her son's bad temper. She rolled her eyes at him. "Shueli just came back and you're already like this. Don't you want a wife?" Yi Mulin put down the documents and looked down at the person in his arms. He smiled. He got off the bed quietly. "Let's go to the small hall to talk." Yi Mubai gave him a mocking look. Yi Mulin walked to the small hall and sat down. He took a sip of hot tea and said slowly, "Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Mubai, you don't understand." Yi Mubai took an apple and took a bite. "What if Shueli and I really got married that day? What would you do?" In fact, he thought about it and felt that something was wrong. His eldest brother really didn't like women. With his current status, it was impossible for him to like Bai Shueli. Although Shueli wasn't annoying, she really wouldn't make his eldest brother unable to let go of her. There was only one possibility, that was, he had liked her long ago. That was why there was a substitute marriage that day. Otherwise, why would his eldest brother make things difficult for himself? Yi Mubai figured it out and found it a little funny. His eldest brother was really coquettish on the inside. So in front of their mother, Yi Mubai exposed him. "Eldest brother, I don't understand. We grew up together. When did you like Shueli?" Not only was Yi Mulin stunned by his question, but Mama Yi was also stunned. Mama Yi was a little confused. "Didn't Shirley chase after you in the past, Mubai?" Fearing that Bai Shueli would wake up, Mama Yi deliberately lowered her voice. She had been steady and gentle all her life, and there were few times when she was like this. Yi Mubai's gaze fell on his big brother, who didn't look too good. He said slowly, "That doesn't stop someone from secretly having a crush on you." "Crush?" Mama Yi froze for a moment. That eldest son of hers who seemed to lack 7 emotions and 6 desires? She looked at Yi Mulin and asked gently, "Is what Mubai said true?" Yi Mulin held a cup of tea in his hand. He glanced at his mother and then at his brother. His eyes were a little fierce. "Mubai, don't talk nonsense." Yi Mubai sighed. "Big brother, Is it so hard to admit that you like her? Emulin lowered his head and gently played with the cup in his hand. He smiled. I didn't say I didn't like her. If he didn't like her, he wouldn't have broken so many exceptions so easily. Imubai smiled mischievously. I'm talking about the past, before you got married. Emulin was still unfathomable. Mubai, what are you trying to see? Chapter 3401. Mama Yi took a look and saw that it was by Shueli's ID photo. It was black and white and looked like she was in high school. So she asked, how did you get Shirley's photo, Mubai? Mubai smiled and looked at Emulin. It's in my brother's wallet. He seems to have used that wallet for many years. His voice became more and more teasing. Brother, you are really good at hiding. You can bear it. I'm really worried that if I marry Shirley, will you seduce her? It wasn't Shirley who would seduce him, but his brother? Mama Yi said in a low voice, don't talk nonsense. Shirley is your brother's wife now. But to her surprise, Emulin answered the question. If you don't like her, I will. Imubai was stunned for a while and then laughed to death. Finally, he was driven away by Mama Yi. Mama Yi was angry and amused. Looking at her eldest son, she was proud and a little speechless. Now there were only two of them. She warned him kindly, don't bully Shirley anymore. I think she is a little stupid but very innocent. Emulin frowned. Mom, you are bullying her. She is a few years younger than you. I know how strong you are. You are just like you when you are old. Who else would want to be with you if not for Shirley's temper? Women are willing to be with you. Who doesn't see the name of the Yi family and how rich you are? Otherwise, they would love you to death and cook for you because of your bad temper? Mama Yi could see through it. Only Shirley, who comes from a rich family, doesn't care about these things. She would rather go out and beg than be with you. Bai Shueli rubbed against Lin Sisi and called her a beggar in Mama Ye's mouth. She didn't feel good when she thought of her precious daughter-in-law being humiliated in someone else's house. She used to wash Shirley's underwear. Mama Yi said so many things but finally left. She couldn't wait to kiss her little wife again. After the ward was quiet again, Emulin realized that his mother didn't seem to ask about his illness. But he soon got over it. Well, he made that rice worm so tired. It was not hard to imagine what was wrong with him. He was not in the mood to read the documents, so he went straight to the bed. She was still sleeping. She was probably really exhausted. He sat there and reached out to gently caress her delicate face. When he thought of how she had hugged his neck last night and begged him to end it over and over again, his heart throbbed and his body became restless. His Adam's apple bobbed, but in the end, he held it in and smiled. The days ahead are long. When Bai Shueli woke up, it was already noon. The smell of food wafted in the air. She sat up with a grunt and scratched her hair. She had also heard noises coming from the kitchen. It was Secretary Li. He was discussing something with Yi Mulin. It seemed that there was something that he had to deal with in the office. She couldn't hear it clearly. Just as she was about to go over, her phone rang. Startled, he quickly picked up the call. It was from Lin Sisi. She only came back at noon after a business trip. When she came back, she saw that the rice worm and the little tortoise were gone. So she called, Bai Shueli, where are you? Bai Shueli covered the microphone and bit her lip. I'm in the hospital. Chapter 3402. Bai Shueli quickly said, Nothing, Yi Mulin is sick. Came to take care of him. Her voice was getting softer and softer. Sure enough, Lin Sisi sneered. What a good girl. Why didn't he ask AI Wei to take care of him when he was sick? Bai Shueli, if you have any backbone, come back. It's worthless for a woman to give in so quickly. He will make trouble again when his wound is healed. Men's diseases are caused by spoiling. Bai Shueli's voice was soft, but he may not live for long. Lin Sisi stood at the door and sneered in her heart. Bai Shueli, are you in bed now? Rice Worm looked at the empty man's shirt and said nothing with guilt. As soon as Lin Sisi heard her silence, she knew what was going on. She sighed. Do you think such a vigorous man will not live long? Bai Shueli, can you use your brain? She hoped that Bai Shuili and Yi Mulin could reconcile, but not in this way. Yi Mulin should lower himself and beg instead of lying. She would be tricked back in a few moves and give Shuili a candy to eat. If she was unhappy one day, she would slap her. This was very damaging. Bai Shuili heard that Lin Sisi was angry and felt even more guilty. "Can I come back?" Lin Sisi stopped her. "No, you can stay here. Remember, come back when you are unhappy. I will take care of you." Bai Shuili was stunned and then said softly, "Sisi, I will work hard to take care of myself." "Really?" Lin Sisi was stunned and then realized that she might have blamed her wrongly. Maybe she was soft-hearted, but her bottom line was always there. It was just that she couldn't see it, and maybe Yi Mulin couldn't see it either. She thought and suddenly smiled. "Call me if you need anything. Keep the key and don't lose it. And take care of Xiao Bai." Bai Shuili smiled and her eyes were sparkling. Sometimes women's friendship was really unpredictable. They were clearly rivals in love, but now they were best friends. Lin Sisi hung up the phone and called Qin Chun. After hanging up, she sneered. Sure enough, it was a trick. However, she didn't tell Bai Shuili because Yi Mulin was very busy. He couldn't stay in the hospital all the time. Just like now, Secretary Li came over and complained, "There are a lot of things that you have to settle personally, Lawyer Yi. We can't make the decision." As she spoke, she watched Lawyer Yi cooking. It was really hard to imagine Lawyer Yi as a house husband, but now she saw it. Yi Mulin put the stir-fried dish on a plate and pondered for a moment. "I'll go to the law firm in the afternoon." Secretary Li nodded and said tactfully, "Then I'll go back first. I won't disturb you, Lawyer Yi." She turned around and was shocked to see Bai Shuili standing behind her. She tried to recall if she had said anything she shouldn't have. Thinking about it, she realized that she hadn't. Then he greeted, "Mrs. Yi." Then he looked at Bai Shuili from head to toe. He was only wearing a man's shirt, and the exposed neck was full of hickeys, messy and warm. Secretary Li cursed in his heart. Lawyer Yi, this dying patient, was really good at acting. In this way, if he died, he would die in the hands of a woman. Secretary Li complained and left. Yi Mulin's gaze fell on Bai Shuili's face. After a while, he said in a low voice, "Go change your clothes and put on your shoes. The clothes are not dry." She walked over and hugged him. "Yi Mulin, you still have to go to the law firm when you're sick?" She saw that it was hard for him to cook, wash her clothes, and work. Was she too much? Chapter 3403. Bai Shuili buried her face in his chest. "Teach me, and I'll make it for you." Yi Mulin's heart warmed a little, but after a while, he still asked her softly, "Shuili, if I wasn't sick, would you still take care of me?" She looked up at him for a long time. "You're not sick." There was a hint of wariness in her eyes, and it was small and sharp. Yi Mulin sighed. "Of course I'm sick. And very sick." After saying that, the wariness in her eyes lessened a little, but she still hugged him and refused to let go. Yi Mulin's expression softened, and he hugged her. "Let's eat, huh?" Bai Shuili looked around the ward and turned her head. "Did Mom come here?" Her words made him feel good, and he ruffled her hair. After dinner, he changed his clothes and prepared to go to the office. Bai Shuili followed him to the changing room and watched him change into a shirt, tie, and cufflinks. She looked at his neat appearance and frowned. "You really don't look like someone who's sick." Yi Mulin looked at himself in the mirror, and their eyes met in the mirror. Then he smiled and reached out to hold her shoulder. "Believe me, I really am sick," he whispered in her ear. "It's lovesickness." She was stunned, and he was half serious. "Wait for me here." He raised his hand and looked at his watch. "I'll be back before 7. After saying that, he pinched her little face and walked out with a dignified air. How did he look like a patient? Bai Shuili bit her lip and walked to the door. "Don't you need me to take care of you?" He turned back. "Let's have dinner together tonight. I won't lie this time." Bai Shuili nodded. She was willing to believe him. After he left, she began to fiddle with those dishes in the kitchen, recognizing them one by one. Then, she searched for cooking methods on her phone, but she couldn't come up with anything even after an entire afternoon. Her little face even had 2 small bruises from being fried, and it hurt like hell. It wasn't until nighttime that she fried a pork rib. Although it didn't look good, it tasted good. Emulin came back after 6, and he didn't look tired at all. After opening the door, he frowned. "You went to the kitchen?" Baishuali stood with her hands behind her back. "Guess what I did?" Emulin looked at the kitchen behind her and smiled. "Let me see." She didn't want to give it to him and insisted on him guessing. Emulin didn't say a word. He walked over and put one arm around her waist. His other hand reached behind her and snatched the plate from her hands. Baishuali shouted anxiously, "Be careful. Don't spill it. It wasn't easy for me to blow it up." He took it and looked at it, then chuckled in a calm voice. She was always afraid of spilling it and didn't dare to touch it, but he still took it. A plate of charred ribs emitted a slightly burnt smell. "You blew it up?" She nodded and looked at him. "Look, my hands and face are all burned." Her face was fine, but there was really a blister on her hand. She stretched it out for him to see. Emulin watched quietly. He felt a little sour in his heart. "Idiot, you're sick. I can't let you cook for me all the time." She looked up at him. "See if it's good." His eyes were still fixed on her. She felt a little uneasy. "Emulin, do you think that I don't cook well?" He shook his head and smiled faintly. "No, it's because I'm happy." He hugged her, holding her with one hand and the plate with the other. He pressed her little head against his chest and said softly, "I'll cook for you in the future. Don't touch these things." Chapter 3404. He looked at her. She raised her head and smiled. "I have to grow up by myself, right, Emulin?" At that moment, his throat seemed to be blocked and he couldn't say a word. Her furry head was buried in his chest. Suddenly, she childishly reached out to hug his waist and threw herself into his arms. He whispered, "Baishuali, you came back because I was sick, didn't you?" She didn't say anything and just hugged him. After a while, she looked up. "Try the ribs. What do you think?" He smiled, held by her, and tasted a piece from the plate in one hand. It didn't taste good, but it was still edible. His eyebrows slowly relaxed and he pinched her face. "It will taste better with some salt." She smiled. "Oh." He went over to take the salt and sprinkled it carefully. He put a piece of ribs in her mouth. "Try it." She looked like a puppy when she ate the ribs. He thought it was quite interesting. So he sat down patiently, took her in his arms, and fed her piece by piece. Baishuali ate piece by piece and unknowingly finished half the plate. She shook her head. "I can't eat anymore." He smiled and ate a few pieces. Then he ordered food and a bottle of red wine. Of course, he didn't drink it himself. He was a patient and it was for the people who took care of him. Baishuali looked at the bottle of red wine and lowered her eyes. "I've forgotten the taste of red wine. I won't drink it." She gave him a small smile. Her careful look made his heart ache. It was the best time to tell the truth and he could be forgiven. His lips moved and he was about to speak when his phone rang. It was his father who asked about him and Baishuali. He could tell that his father was worried and wanted to ask about it. However, Baishuali was beside him, so he didn't ask. He put down the phone. She had already run away and he called her name. Her voice came from the toilet. "My stomach hurts." Emulin thought about it. It was probably because she ate too many ribs. He knocked on the door. "Can Baishuali come out? I'll take you to the emergency room." She refused and said angrily, "It's all because you fed me so many ribs. Emulin, I hate you so much." He laughed. "Didn't you fry the ribs?" Panting with rage, she said, "Then go away. It's none of your business." He laughed. It was funny, but also a little heartache and a little sour. After waiting outside for a while, he could hear her soft cries coming from inside. He could not wait any longer, so he pushed the door open and walked in. The rice worm was sitting on the toilet bowl, its face pale. His smile immediately disappeared. He squatted in front of her. "Does it hurt a lot?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "Get out." Even if they were husband and wife, They wouldn't want others to see them going to the toilet, especially when they were in such a sorry state. She tried to push him away, but to no avail. Instead, he caught her hand. "Put on your clothes and call me later. I'll come over and take you to the emergency room. Otherwise, I'll clean your butt myself." She stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. He smiled. "I'll really do it." Bai Shuili was furious. She slapped his face with her hand and said, "Then go away." He smiled. "You really want me to go? I want to put on my clothes." Her voice was weak. Chapter 3405. After walking out, he reached out and touched his forehead. Sigh, she was obviously a shallow girl who couldn't even take care of herself. Why did he care about her so much? She took out a cigarette and smoked it to calm her overflowing emotions. After smoking half a cigarette, she called out weakly, "Yi Mulin." He put out the cigarette and walked in. She stood there trembling with a painful look on her face. "Yi Mulin, I think my feet are cramping." Amused and annoyed, he carried her outside and placed her on the sofa. He squatted down to massage her feet. Her feet were very white, and every toe was beautiful. When he saw them, he would think of 4 words: pampered and pampered. He held them and was lost in thought for a while. Bai Shuili stared at his eyes and asked in a low voice, "Will you kiss me like a pervert?" He smiled. "Why would I?" He got up and carried her. "Let's go and have a look." She stopped him. "I'm much better. I don't want to go in the middle of the night." "Bai Shuili, I'm a patient." She looked at him carrying her and walking quickly. "Is there a patient as strong as you?" Yi Mulin thought for a while. "I have an endocrine disorder. It has nothing to do with physical strength." Bai Shuili looked at him. "Endocrine disorder? Can you die?" She looked like she didn't believe it. Yi Mulin wanted to tease her, so he deliberately put on a straight face. "If there is no channel, I will die." "Does burning with jade fire count?" He thought that they had actually reconciled. He thought that his words had shown that the illness was fake. No matter how stupid she was, she wouldn't be so stupid. However, he neglected one thing, and that was that he was confused because of his concern. He had always been serious, and she had never suspected that he would lie. He carried her to the emergency room. It was not a big problem. She just had a stomachache, and she would be fine after drinking some water. When they returned to the ward, she complained that she was fine, and Yi Mulin just smiled. He went to the study to deal with some business matters, and she watched TV out of boredom. Everything was the same as in the apartment. At night, he came back and wanted her as passionately as last night. She pushed him with her fingers and whispered, "Can you still eat like this?" She grimaced and furrowed her eyebrows to show her agreement. He smiled and kissed her. "Isn't that normal?" She felt that it was strange. Wasn't he supposed to be the most particular? However, his strength was shockingly great. Throughout the night, Yi Mulin had half a push and half a give in. It was close to 2 in the morning. Yi Mulin leaned against the headboard and turned his head to look at the little fellow who was sleeping soundly. She was exhausted. After 2 nights of ferocious lovemaking, he was a little out of control. He didn't know if it was because of the one-point incident that triggered him, or if Sister Lee's health stuff was too powerful. Either way, he was too fierce, and she kept crying. Tonight, he let her off the hook. She woke up in a daze. In the dim light, she opened her eyes and looked at him. Her expression was like that of a soft animal. His heart was also soft. He asked him softly, "Does it hurt?" She thought he was talking about her stomach, so she shook her head. "It doesn't hurt anymore." He smiled and slid down to kiss her. He held her little face and kissed her carefully. He kissed her until her toes curled up. She gently stuck to the side of his leg, looking very delicate and obedient. Chapter 3406. Her eyes widened as she realized why he asked her if it hurt. She nodded her head fiercely. He smiled. "You can't wait?" He was going to do it for real. Rice Worm was so anxious that she put her little hand on his lips to stop him from doing it. Yi Mulin chuckled. "Didn't you say yes just now?" She bit her lips. No, I didn't say yes just now either. I said my stomach doesn't hurt anymore." Then, "Does it hurt there?" he asked as he went over to check. She was pressed down by him. Her little face was red and her hair was messy. It was really tempting. And the process of him checking was really shameful. She grabbed his hand and said weakly, "Don't be like this, Emulin. Take your hand away." Her voice was hoarse as if she was about to cry. No man could stand her like this. Moreover, they had been separated for a long time. If he kissed her, he would have to forcefully get his way. After that, she didn't make a sound and just cried softly. He hugged her from behind. "What's wrong? Weren't you fine just now?" She didn't move and whispered after a while, "Emulin, you're not sick, right? You're lying to me, aren't you?" In fact, she took everything he said seriously. What really made her think that he was not sick was his wolf-like vigor. If he really couldn't live, he wouldn't be in such a good mood. His body stiffened for a moment. He placed his hand on her fair shoulder and gently touched it. He grunted in acknowledgement. Actually, he didn't act seriously when he said he had a terminal illness. She should have found out long ago. But this little fool only found out now. She lost her temper at him late at night after sex. She still had her back to him and sniffed, "I'll leave tomorrow." He frowned. "I thought we made up. You're so hateful." She kicked him hard and fiercely like before. "Emulin, you bastard. Get off the bed." He was such a proud man. How could he be kicked out of the bed by a woman? He restrained her in a few moves. "It seems that you still have a lot of energy. How about we do it again, She was so angry that she scolded, "Emulin, you bastard. You're shameless. How about a different phrase?" He chuckled. She already knew anyway, so he didn't care about his reputation anymore. He could be as shameless as he wanted to be. Baishuali glared at him and slowly spat out 3 words, "Brother Ethan." This thoroughly infuriated him. He grinded his snow-white teeth and said slowly, "Is that so?" In the end, he devoured her until not even her bones were left. A life worse than death. Half alive and half dead. It wasn't until dawn that he finally let her go. She immediately curled up and said in a weak voice, "Are you satisfied now?" His body was satisfied, but when he saw her like this, he felt uncomfortable. However, men were usually willing to coax women after their bodies were satisfied. Hence, he hugged her and said, "Let's make up, okay?" As he coaxed her, he kissed her delicate little face and took good care of her. He even carried her to the bathroom for a fragrant bath. Baishuali was really exhausted. She felt that he was simply a beast, simply treating her as a tool to let out Jade. Chapter 3407. Hit me then. She was furious. She sat up and unbuttoned her shirt. "Haven't you been cruel enough? Hit me again if you can." All of a sudden, he saw the boundless colors of spring. The bruises and the ambiguous marks showed how intense they had been just now. He was a little angry at first, but now he actually laughed. He reached out and rubbed her face gently. "It still hurts. Why are you teasing me again? Does it really not hurt anymore?" Baishuali looked down. "I'll leave at dawn." He looked at the sky outside. "It seems like it's already dawn." She glared at him and fell asleep angrily. He smiled and got off the bed to pour a glass of milk for her. "You probably can't sleep. Drinking some milk will help you sleep." "I don't need it," she said coldly and wrapped herself tightly with the blanket. "I don't want to talk to such a shameless man like you." He looked at her and said slowly, "Since I'm already shameless, I don't mind bullying you a few more times." She opened her eyes immediately. "Emulin, what do you want?" He brought the milk to her lips. "Drink the milk." His tone was a little domineering and irresistible. Baishuali was stunned. She sat up and stared at him. Then she took the milk and drank it in one gulp. He looked at her and didn't say anything. There were sleeping pills in the milk. She fell asleep quickly after drinking it. She was quiet and obedient. Emulin looked at her silently for a long time. Then he took the clothes for her and carried her out. When Baishuali woke up again, she was already on the bed in the master bedroom. The sun shone on the luxurious bed and it was a little dazzling. She covered her eyes and moved uncomfortably. The next second, she stared at her hand. On her ring finger, there was a huge diamond shining. It was the one she wore before. She was in a daze. Looking at the ring, she sat up instinctively. She was surrounded by a familiar yet strange place. The smell was also familiar yet strange. Xiao Bai was placed on the bedside table. Beside it was the credit card she had used before. The black diamond was 20 million a month. In addition, he put a check under the card. Bai Shuili picked it up and looked at it. 100 million. She stared at the number. There were so many zeros behind it. There were footsteps at the door. She looked up and saw Yi Mulin. He was fastening his cufflinks. They were made of black crystal and they sparkled. He looked at her and said softly, "Get up and eat. I'm going to play golf with a client later. Do you want to go?" Bai Shuili looked at him and gently picked up the check. "What is this? Is it guilt, compensation, or bribery?" Yi Mulin put down his hand and looked at her silently for a while. He slowly revealed a smile. "Don't you like shopping the most?" "Yes, I like to buy." She flipped her hair. Shallow people like to buy things. They spend a lot of money to buy a bunch of things they can't use. They don't even blink. They're the parasites of society. He walked in, bent over and kissed the corner of her lips. "Don't talk about yourself like that. I don't like it." There was a hint of heat in her eyes. "I'm also a flirtatious woman, and I like to hug different men. Yi Mulin, it's really not worth it for you to spend 100 million on me." Chapter 3408. She looked at him. "I don't want to have children for the time being." He took out a small box of medicine from his pocket. "It'll be effective for 48 hours if you don't want to have children for the time being." She held the small box, took out a small pill from it and swallowed it. Yi Mulin didn't say anything. "Let's eat." He went out first. She washed her face and brushed her teeth. She didn't mention anything about leaving again. In the afternoon, she accompanied him to play golf. It was a heavyweight client, a big shot that Bai Shuili often saw on TV. The big shot also brought a female companion. She was about the same age as his daughter. She was definitely not the heavyweight wife. When they met, she looked at Bai Shuili and smiled at Yi Mulin. "Madam is very beautiful. You should bring her out to socialize often." Yi Mulin smiled. "My mother likes her company very much, so she seldom comes out." The big shot patted his shoulder. "Young people should come out for a walk." After that, the two men went to play golf. Bai Shuili knew that the man brought a mistress or a mistress or a mistress. She didn't bother to pay attention to it. She sat under the umbrella and played with her delicate nails. She went out today in a white Chanel set with jewelry, just like before. However, she felt a little bored. The woman also knew who she was, so she came over and said a few words. Seeing that Bai Shuili ignored her, she didn't thicken her skin anymore. They drank and waited for 2 hours in boredom before the men finished playing. Then they had dinner together in the high-class restaurant on the golf course. Of course, the conversation was still about work. An afternoon passed. When he drove her back, it was already 8 o'clock at night. She sat next to him absent-mindedly. Yi Mulin asked softly, "What are you thinking about?" Bai Shuili smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about what Xiao Bai will eat tonight." He looked at her and asked after a moment of silence, "Not happy today?" "Of course I am." She squeezed a smile at him. "The dinner was delicious, and the husband next to me is also very outstanding. I have nothing to be dissatisfied with. But your face is full of desire and dissatisfaction." He whispered, "What am I not doing well, Bai Shuili?" She chuckled softly. "You're pretty good, really. Yi Mulin, I believe that out of 10,000 women, at least 9,999 want to marry you. And the other one?" he asked her calmly. Bai Shuili squeezed out a smile. "Your mother." He looked at the night sky and the stars outside, and his voice was even more calm. "Why do you sound like it's you?" She lazily turned her face to the side and smiled mischievously. "How could it be me? I'm already married to you." After that, he didn't ask again, and she didn't answer either. After they went back together, he went to the study, and she went into the room to take a shower and play with Xiaobai for a long time. When Yimulin finished his work and returned to the bedroom, he saw that she was already asleep with the box in her hands. However, Little White had already crawled out. He bent over, picked up Little White, put it back into the box, and put it back on the cabinet by the door. After watching for a while, Little White also stretched out its head and stared at him quietly. "She has lost weight, but you have gained weight." He smiled, took his bathrobe and went to take a shower. He should have let her go tonight, but thinking of what she said in the car, he didn't want to let her go. So he pressed her down. She woke up without much resistance and just whispered, "Did you buy condoms?" He continued to do it unwillingly, but he still opened the drawer and took out the condoms. After that, she gasped and said softly, "When did you buy them?" Yimulin put one hand behind his head. "I bought them together with the medicine." He got up to take care of himself and said lightly, "I can't let you keep taking medicine." She blinked and didn't say anything. When Yimulin returned to the bedroom again, she was still not asleep and was playing with her phone. He lay down and asked, "What are you looking at?" Gu Chongfeng came back, and I asked him when he was free to have dinner together. She said casually. As soon as she finished speaking, her sharp chin was pinched. He stared at her and said with a hoarse voice, "By Xueli." She looked at him. "You can come with me." He stared at her for a long time. "You can hang out with female friends." She lay back and bit her nails. "You don't like those friends of mine. But you don't need to hang out with Gu Chongfeng." He pulled her into his arms and put her in his arms. "You can look for Lin Cece." She did not resist in his arms, but said coldly, "Do I have to get your permission to make friends in the future?" "It's not permission, it's to help you choose suitable friends," he said calmly, and then turned off the light and lay down. He said softly, "Sleep, unless you still want to come." As soon as he finished speaking, a pair of delicate arms wrapped around his neck, and she kissed the corner of his mouth. Yimulin stared at her in the dark. "Xueli?" she said while kissing him. "Isn't it too early to sleep?" She took out a box of condoms from the drawer, which was bought by him. There were 8 condoms in a box, and he used one. "Can you use all of them tonight?" Her eyes were shining in the dark. Yimulin looked at her. "Are you sure?" She chuckled in a low voice. "Yes." As soon as she finished speaking, he turned over and kissed her passionately on the lips. "As you wish." She did not know whether they used up the whole box, but he was very satisfied when it was over. She had no strength, so she softened under his body. She calmed down for a long time, and then whispered with her back to him, "No more." He smiled, hugged her from behind, and fell asleep together. Because of the indulgence of a few nights, it was normal for her to sleep late. When she woke up, she heard a strange voice coming from the living room outside. She got up wearing Yimulin's shirt, which he changed for her after last night. He seemed to like wearing his own shirt for her. It was very tempting to wear only a shirt, with her long, straight, and white legs. She walked out and saw 4 staff moving things into the apartment. They saw her coming out and smiled. "Mrs. Yi, these are gifts from Mr. Yi." Bai Shuili walked over and looked at the neatly placed gifts. There were dozens of Hermes limited edition bags, watches, and jewelry. Every one of them was expensive and glittering, which suited her temperament very much. She blinked gently to get rid of the moisture in her eyes. She looked up and smiled very reservedly. "Tell Mr. Yi that I like them very much." The staff smiled. "Then put them here. You can decide where to put them." Bai Shuili nodded and went out. Chapter 3409. After they left, she looked at the gifts and smiled faintly. Aunt Lee came over, wiped her hands and said happily, "Oh, there are so many good things. So dazzling. It must be at least 1,000,000 yuan. Lawyer Yi is really good to you, madam." "Good?" Bai Shuili smiled and looked down. "There are at least 100 million yuan here." Then, she picked up a classic Hermes bag and gave it to the aunt. "This is for you to buy groceries." The aunt looked at the bag and said, "You want to buy groceries with such a good bag? How much does it cost?" Bai Shuali said casually, more than 100,000 yuan. The auntie shrieked, Madam, I can't accept that. I only need a cloth bag worth about 10 yuan for groceries. This bag doesn't look sturdy. If it breaks, I'll lose more than 100,000 yuan. Bai Shuali still gave it to her. If you have a daughter, give it to her. She'll be very happy. The aunt hesitated for a moment and accepted it. Then I'll accept it. Madam, you're really a good person. Bai Shuali flipped her hair. Move these to the room. I want to sleep for a while. The aunt moved it happily. She looked back at Bai Shuali, who was very sleepy, and coughed. Madam, are you pregnant? You don't look very energetic. If you're pregnant, you need to nourish yourself. By the way, I gave Lawyer Yi a very good nourishment last time. He had a nosebleed and was hospitalized for a few days. Bai Shuali sat up and looked at the aunt. No wonder, she said softly. No wonder he was like a wolf in the hospital, as if his wife had died 10 years ago and he hadn't touched a woman. She lay down straight, and her movements were a little rough. The aunt was frightened. She held her and said carefully, It'll be dangerous if you're pregnant. Bai Shuali looked at the aunt and smiled faintly. Yi Mulin used a condom. The aunt was stunned, and then her face turned red. What do you mean by condoms? Young people nowadays really don't have any taboos when they talk. Bai Shuali looked at the aunt's red face and couldn't help laughing. Aunt, what's wrong? She pushed her and said, Let me sleep for a while. I'm so tired. The aunt ran quickly. In the afternoon, when Bai Shuali woke up, the auntie had already gone out to prepare food for her. After eating, she played some games for a while. Then, she went to the changing room to play with the jewelry that Yi Mulin had given her. After playing for a while, she felt a little tired and went out for a walk. He didn't go shopping as he felt very bored. He put on a casual outfit and went out to look at the flowers and plants outside, as well as the children in the amusement park who were led by young mothers to play outside. She suddenly remembered that she was actually 26 years old, so she wasn't young anymore, but she was still wandering around. Although she was married, children. She had never thought of having children, especially Yi Mulin. It wasn't that she hadn't thought about it. Back then, she had been foolish enough to discuss it with him. At that time, she felt that he was perfect in every way. He was mature, charming, successful in his career, and had great stamina. But later, she realized that if such a man didn't respect you, no matter how good he wasn't yours. At most, you were his. That was all. Bai Shuali watched quietly. Suddenly, she picked up her phone and dialed Yi Mulin's number. His deep voice came from the other side. What's wrong? Chapter 34:10. Bai Shuali said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, where are you? He seemed to be in a meeting, and his voice was very low. I'll call you later, okay? His voice was gentle. She knew that this was what he wanted to do to make it up to her recently. She didn't know why, but she wanted to cry. This wasn't what she wanted. She said, oh, and hung up the phone. She continued to sit there and watch those little children playing there in little dresses. She was a little envious. She thought that it was good to have children. At least there would be someone to accompany her. At least she wouldn't be so lonely anymore. As she watched, her eyes began to heat up. After about half an hour, Yi Mulin used the break in the middle of the meeting to call her. Because they had just reconciled, he spoke to her very gently and spoiled her as if she was his wife. What's wrong? Bai Shuali shook her head. Nothing, he said in a low voice. I'm in a meeting. I'm a little busy today. I'll try to go back earlier tonight. You don't have to come back to accompany me. I can eat by myself outside. Oh, I can also find friends to play for a while and go to the mall. I love shopping, don't I? Her voice was also very soft and a little absent-minded. Yi Mulin smiled. Okay, I'll be there. He raised his hand and looked at his watch. Go back before 8 tonight. Let's go back and have supper together. Okay? She nodded. I'm hanging up. Someone is calling me. He wanted to say something else, but she had already hung up. Yi Mulin looked at his phone and was in deep thought. This time she came back different from before. Although she still spent money to eat and sleep, it was really different. They lived in the old house of the Yi family. In fact, their relationship was very good. She would stick to him and act coquettishly with him. Sometimes, she would even take the initiative to hug him when they were sleeping because she wanted him to hug her and love her. She had high hopes for him. Now that she was back, they ate, slept, and made love, but there seemed to be something missing. It seemed that she had become extremely passive. Even if she was dissatisfied, she wouldn't say it like before. She would do whatever he wanted her to do, and she would no longer take the initiative. Emulin thought that they should still move back to the main house. With his mother accompanying her, she wouldn't be so bored and she wouldn't think too much. The most important thing was that she wouldn't want to get a divorce. He thought that it would be put on the agenda after a while. When he was free, he would bring her back to the apartment. Secretary Lee came over to remind him of the meeting, and he put away his phone. The meeting lasted until 7 o'clock in the evening. He declined his subordinate's suggestion to have dinner together and drove back to his apartment. He thought that she would be at home watching TV, playing games, or soaking in the bathtub. However, after searching all over the place, they still couldn't find her. He frowned and dialed her number. The phone rang a few times before she picked it up. "You're home." He listened to the stereo on the other side and frowned even more. "Are you in a bar?" "Yes, is it against the law?" She chuckled. Emulin looked at the night sky and untied his tie tiredly. "Where are you? I'll pick you up." She smiled and gave the address. Emulin appeared there in less than half an hour. He had an aura of abstinence and was very eye-catching. He ignored the gazes and walked straight in. Chapter 34:11. Emulin walked over calmly and said lightly, "What's wrong?" Bai Shuali looked up at him, her gaze a little indifferent. She supported her head and waved for the waiter to bring a glass of wine. She pushed it in front of him. "Do you want a drink?" He sat and looked at her quietly. "I'm going to drive." She smiled. She leaned on the table and laughed a little exaggeratedly. After laughing for a while, she leaned on her arm and looked at him with one eye. "Emulin, look at you. You're always like this. You're always following the rules. You're not like me at all. We don't see eye to eye. How can two people like you live together for a long time?" He held the glass of wine gently and rubbed his eyebrows. "Will we have the same views after drinking the wine?" She looked at him provocatively. He looked around and smiled. "You're my wife. I have to take you home safely. So, you don't want a drink?" She opened her eyes and stared at him. He looked at her and whispered, "I'll ask someone to drink for me." Her eyes widened and she looked at him. He smiled and then held her head with one hand and handed the glass to her with the other. "I'll carry you home when you're drunk." Bai Shuali was furious. "I don't want a drink. Don't you like excitement? I'm cooperating with you." He raised his head and took a sip. Then he held her head and kissed her. She could feel the spicy wine being passed to her through the kiss. Every mouthful was spicy, and mixed with the man's scent, it was even more intoxicating. Just as the kiss ended, another kiss followed. 5 minutes later, he had fed her a glass of wine. When it ended, he licked his lower lip gently. "Go home if you're satisfied." Her lips moved. Before she could say anything, he carried her in his arms. It was a princess carry. Bai Shuali was stunned for a moment and immediately hugged his neck tightly. She buried her face in his arms so that no one could see her. He looked at her. "Are you afraid of embarrassing yourself?" "No, this is my place." She glared at him, but her eyes were filled with tears. Emulin put her down. In a dark corner, he pressed her against the wall and kissed her. In the dark and gloomy corner, there were messy breaths and soft sounds of passion. Her hands tightened on his shoulders, wrinkling the expensive shirt, but he didn't care. He passionately kissed the girl in his arms. She was very disobedient. Unable to control her emotions, she whispered, "Emulin, do you want to do it here?" He sobered up a little and stared at her. His voice was low and husky. "Bai Shuali, be obedient." She lowered her eyes, and her long eyelashes trembled slightly because of her emotions. "You've never seen me misbehave." She lifted her head. Let's do it at home, okay? He couldn't tell if she was drunk or not. If she wasn't drunk, why did she suddenly take the initiative and want him so much? His fingers moved downwards and bit her on the neck. He carried her out and got into the car, returning to the condominium as fast as he could. He opened the door, but he didn't even turn on the lights. He just appeared behind the door. He wasn't gentle, and she didn't need it. The alcohol burned everything. When everything cooled down, her voice rang out in the darkness. I want to lie down. Chapter 34:12. He was still pressing down on her. She was already in a mess while he was still acting like an elite. He reached out to look at his watch and mumbled, I've been busy till now and I haven't even had a bite to eat. Bishuali, are you trying to eat me up? She raised her head and looked at his angry face. Suddenly, she burst out laughing. She buried her face in the pillow and chuckled. Yi Mulin, you're blaming me for not eating? I didn't ask you to look for me. Whether you're happy or unhappy, it's all your own fault. He stared at her and suddenly reached out to pinch her chin while glaring at her. Bishuali, do you know that you're despicable? She was right in front of him, but she used her actions to show her disdain. She didn't even want to look at the gifts he bought for her. She just wanted to go to the bar and drink. Bishuali was still chuckling as though she was drunk. She looked at him and said softly, In the past, I always felt that we weren't compatible because you were too serious and I like to live an extravagant life. But now I know that it doesn't matter whether you live or not. You know how to spend money and you like to spend money. As she said that, she closed her eyes slightly. But you bought so many things for me, but I don't feel happy at all. Tell me what's wrong. Do I not like money anymore? She laughed exaggeratedly on the bed and bit her lips. No, it's the problem between us. It's not that you're too outstanding, but I'm too lousy. Emulin, look, when you're busy, I don't even know what I should be doing. I'm outside looking at other people taking care of their children. I'm even thinking if I should give birth to a child so that I won't be lonely. She looked at him in tears. I have no value. My only value is to give birth to a child. And my body. She put her arms around his neck. You like making love to me, don't you? If you don't like it, if you're not satisfied with my body, would you still give in to me like this? Would you still bring me home from the bar? Wouldn't you want to divorce me? Because I'm so lousy and worthless. How am I good enough for you? Between them, it wasn't a matter of whether they were compatible or not. In fact, they were not compatible at all. That was why there were so many problems. She wasn't independent. She used to belong to the Bai family, but now she belonged to Yi Mulin. It was only when she was slightly drunk that she dared to look into his eyes and tell him softly, Yi Mulin, I'm not happy. I'm not happy at all. She cried and closed her eyes. This place is like a cage. Our marriage is like a cage. You are more like a cage. Locking me up, I can't breathe. Only now did she realize that no amount of money could buy happiness. Only now did she realize that there was such a person. You couldn't match up to him just because you looked good. You couldn't enter his heart just by acting coquettishly. Maybe he liked you a little, but no matter how much he liked you, no matter how much physical contact they had, they would always be like two parallel lines that could never intersect. Yi Mulin lowered his head. His gaze locked onto her little face. She had fallen into a light sleep because of the alcohol. She could hold her liquor well, but she would get drunk easily when she was in a bad mood. Chapter 34:13. He held his forehead and suddenly smiled helplessly. When you're awake, you'll say that we don't have the same views again. He slowly got up and sat on the edge of the bed. After a while, he went to the bathroom to get a towel to help her clean up. After that, he covered her with the quilt and looked at her gently for a long time. After a long time, he got up and walked to the changing room to change his clothes. However, he saw that she had thrown the jewelry everywhere and didn't seem to care at all. He let out a long sigh and went back to pick them up one by one. After changing his clothes, he walked out and stood by the bed looking at her calm face. He stretched out his finger and touched it gently. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. Bai Shuili, what do you want? She was asleep and couldn't answer him. He stood there quietly and felt that the whole world was silent. After a long time, he went out and made himself a bowl of noodles. He smoked and ate the noodles. She was at home. It should have been full, but he still felt lonely. He wanted to wake that despicable woman up and sweat with him, but he couldn't bear to do so. Her face was a bit pale. He knew that he had been indulging in sex for the past few days. After eating the noodles, he sat on the armrest of the sofa and looked at the night outside. He sat there for half the night. At night, she screamed from the master bedroom. He immediately put out the cigarette and walked back. The bedroom was dark. She stood at the door of the bathroom and touched her forehead. It hurts. He walked over and reached out to hold her. He was annoyed and amused at the same time. How can you hit your head while walking? Surely, what did you eat when you were growing up? She immediately hugged him and put her face on his shoulder. Much cuter. It's more like it. He snorted but still hugged her and carried her to the toilet in the bathroom. Okay. Tell me, will you drink so much next time? The last one. You were the one who fed me the last one. She sat there and closed her eyes. Why didn't the police arrest you for drunk driving? Yi Mulin sneered. It seems that they treat you too well. She hadn't gone to the toilet yet, so he carried her down and pressed her against the wall. She sobered up and widened her eyes. Yi Mulin, put me down. I need to go to the toilet. He pressed her down, looking like he had no intention of letting her go. Her eyes widened even more. Aren't you bored? I said I want to go to the toilet. I really want to go to the toilet. Beg me. Kiss me again. I'll let you go. He smiled at her. She seemed to be unable to believe that the person in front of her was Yi Mulin. She struggled. You bastard, I won't beg. Then we'll just continue wasting time here. He smiled and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He lit it with one hand and took a puff. He even blew a puff of smoke on her little face. She felt that he was extremely bad. Biting her lips, she said, I really can't help it. I don't mind. He looked at her. Have you thought about it? She was so angry that her face was red from holding it in. He looked at her. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and quickly kissed him on the lips. Her voice was like a mosquito. Please carry me over. Yimu bit Lin Yan's lips and carried her back to the toilet. She yelled angrily, Get out! He smiled and walked out. He leaned against the door and waited for her. She didn't come out even after a long time. Instead, someone started to cry. She was crying very sadly. Chapter 34:14. He walked into the bathroom and looked at her pathetic face. He sighed softly. What should I do to make you happier? She buried her face in his bosom and wept bitterly. Yi Mulin hugged her and lowered his head. Is the toilet ready? She didn't make a sound, so he wiped her butt for her. This was the only time he had ever done this before. He carried her back to the bedroom and placed her on the soft and warm bed. She fell asleep again, but he didn't sleep the whole night. He only took a nap when it was almost dawn. When he woke up, he was a little dizzy. There was a noise outside. It should be Auntie Lee. He lowered his head and looked at the person in his arms. She really didn't have any thoughts and was still asleep. He lowered his head and looked at her. His gaze was a little gentle. He reached out and caressed her face. No matter how he looked at her, she was pleasing to the eye. Baishuali woke up in a daze. The moment she opened her eyes, she saw his handsome face. She blinked and stared at him. Yi Mulin reached out and held her little hand. You're awake. She bit her lower lip and stared at him. She asked hesitantly, Was I drunk last night? Yi Mulin turned over and pressed her down. She moved and found that his palm was pressing down on her hair. She couldn't move at all, so she bit her lower lip. Let go of me. Yi Mulin looked at her face and said absent-mindedly, Aren't you the little princess of the nightclub? How did you get drunk? It's easy to get drunk when you're in a bad mood. She looked at him as if she was an idiot. Yi Mulin was sure that she was really drunk last night and didn't remember much. He chuckled. I better not tell you. Why? Her eyes were a little round and she looked a little stupid. Emulin chuckled again. I'm afraid you can't take the blow. She still stared at him and didn't say anything. He lowered his head and kissed her with his beautiful thin lips. Then, he bit her plump lips and said hoarsely, Shuali, I didn't know you would wet the bed when you're drunk. Wet the bed. She was shocked and stared at him. However, he was still nibbling on her lips unhurriedly. You don't believe me? Our sheets have been changed. She stammered. Didn't the bed sheets get soiled because we had sex? We did it last night, but we didn't sleep on the bed. He glanced outside the door. We did it by the door. Don't you remember? She blushed. That doesn't exclude the possibility that we'll end up in bed. It's true that she wets the bed, but if you must deny it, I won't object. After all, my wife is so old, and wetting the bed isn't something I should be proud of, he said kindly. Baishuali pulled him closer. You're lying. He chuckled softly. It was a very joyful and very beautiful smile. She was angry, but she couldn't help but stare at his handsome face. She kept convincing herself that she couldn't be conquered by his sugar-coated bullets. Emulin, don't press down on me. She bit her lip and couldn't help but say, Oh, he said, moving away a little as his cell phone rang. He pressed her down with one hand and picked up the phone with the other. Secretary Lee. Chapter 34:15. Emulin looked at the time. It was already past working hours. He paused and said, I'll come at 10:30. He remembered that there was an important meeting at 10:30. Secretary Lee replied with an oh, but her mind was filled with endless thoughts. Lawyer Yi was still not at work at this time, so he must be making a baby at home. On the other side, Emulin hung up the phone and his eyes fell on his wife. She struggled for a long time, and her pajamas were loose because of her struggle. It was quite tempting. His eyes turned dark. Baishuali looked at him defensively and bit her lips. Emulin, what do you want? He chuckled softly and tossed the phone away. His hands clasped hers and raised them above her head, pressing them against the pillow. Their fingers intertwined. She struggled a little. Emulin, go to work. Get up. She struggled, and her hair was messy like a little crazy. He simply held her with one hand and pushed her hair aside with the other, revealing her red face. He kissed her. There's still half an hour. I don't want to. Emulin, you bastard. Don't you dare. Don't. She was still kissed by him. The kiss was very deep, and he bullied her while kissing her. She wanted to scream and scold him, but she also heard the sound of Auntie Lee cleaning outside. The robot sweeper turned and made a rhythmic sound. Emulin let go of her lips and kissed her brightly colored lips reluctantly. He murmured, Why don't you scream? Don't you like to scream? She felt very uncomfortable being bullied by him. She bit her lips hard, tears glistened in her eyes, and fine beads of sweat seeped into her hair. She looked very innocent. Emulin kissed her again and again. I can't help but scream. Auntie Lee is also an experienced person. She won't come in. Of course, she didn't want to, he was too cruel. Her nails left a long mark on his firm back, and it immediately turned red. However, this only made him treat her more crudely. He knew that she was very weak now, but he still couldn't help it. Baishuali was bullied to the point that she wanted to die. She cried out. Auntie Lee turned off the robot and poked her head in to listen. What was that sound? Shuali, are you not feeling well? Auntie Lee didn't know that Emulin didn't go to work. She thought that Baishuali was alone in the apartment and that she wasn't feeling well. Thus, he decided to come over and show some concern. Although Shirley didn't know anything, she was quite adorable. Holding the doorknob, Aunt Lee politely asked again, Shirley. Baishuali was extremely anxious. She hit the person on top of her with all her might. Get off. Don't come, bastard. But how could that bastard stop now? He pressed her down and bullied her. Auntie Lee was coming in. Baishuali was so anxious that her eyes were red. Auntie, I'm fine. Are you all right? My voice is so soft. Auntie Lee said and was about to open the door. Rice Worm cried. His little face turned to the side as he silently shed tears. Emulin knew that he had gone overboard, so he said in a low voice, "No need to come in." Auntie Lee froze. "Lawyer Yi is at home? Then didn't that mean that just now?" Instantly, his face reddened. In the bedroom, Yi Mulin gently pulled by Shueli's face. "Are you angry?" She bit the pillow and said nothing, looking angry. Chapter 34:16. She was still crying, and her voice was soft. So he left. She immediately looked up at him. "Yi Mulin." He kissed her. "I'm going to take a shower and go to work." She was a little anxious. She suddenly hugged him and buried her face in his neck. He chuckled. "What's wrong?" She didn't say anything and just hugged him. Yi Mulin's bad taste was fully displayed. He stretched out his hand and gently rubbed her face. "You obviously like me, but you have to pretend that you don't like me." She wanted to let go of him, but she was afraid that he would really leave her alone. So she could only grit her teeth. When Yi Mulin pressed her down again, she turned her face away in embarrassment. He smiled gently and kissed her. Bai Shueli was bullied badly by him, but she could see that he was holding back at the last moment. Because he had to go to work at 10. She bit her lips and hugged him willfully. When he was about to get up, she ignored everything and kissed his lips. Yi Mulin lowered his head and looked at the woman in his arms with indulgence. He gently pressed her shoulder. "Shueli, don't be naughty. I have something important to do." She didn't care and kissed him stubbornly. At first, he had no choice but to coax her to deal with it. But as he dealt with it, he couldn't hold back anymore. She succeeded in making him break the contract. Secretary Lee called him one after another. Finally, he picked up the phone. His voice was a little hoarse. "Change the date." After saying that, he threw the phone. He was a little annoyed while he was making out with his wife. He bullied her over and over again. When it was over, it was already noon. Aunt Lee prepared the meal with a red face. After cleaning the room, she went straight to Z. Yi Mulin took a shower and came out feeling refreshed. He looked at the dishes and found that it was Rice Worm's favorite. He smiled and returned to the bedroom. He sat on the bed. "Get up and eat." Rice Worm wrapped herself in the quilt and turned around to face him. "I don't want to." He smiled. "Are you being naughty again? Didn't you take the initiative just now?" She said softly. Her voice was a little hoarse like a little lamb. "But I didn't let you do it many times. I only wanted to do it once." Yi Mulin was angry and amused at the same time. He sat down and patted her back. "You messed up my conversation. Are you still angry?" She ignored him. "I want to sleep." "Eat before you sleep," he insisted. "Otherwise, I'll pull you up and do it a few more times." She immediately turned around and glared at him. "I don't believe you still have energy." "Really?" He lay down and held her waist, pressing her against him. "Do you still feel that way now?" Being scalded by him, she bit her lips in embarrassment, anger, and fear. "Do you still want to get up?" He lowered his head and kissed her lips. "Actually, I don't have anything to do in the afternoon. I don't mind staying in bed with you." Glaring at him, she sat up and bumped his chin. He curled up at the head of the bed. "I'm getting up." He chuckled softly. "If you had been so obedient earlier, you wouldn't have screamed so miserably." He got up and said, "I'm going to get some rice. Brush your teeth and wash your face." "I don't want to," she provoked. Standing at the door, he picked up Little White and said slowly, "I'm short of soup today. This little guy is quite nutritious." "Put it down." Bai Shueli shrieked. She couldn't care less about her messy clothes and ran over barefooted to put Little White down. She then ran to the bathroom. He stood behind her and looked at her quietly. Then he chuckled softly. Actually, she was quite gullible. Chapter 34:17. When she came out, Yi Mulin was already waiting for her in the dining room. He was reading the newspaper while eating. His white shirt was neatly ironed. His tie was tied with a grayish-blue stripe, and his cufflinks were quite exquisite. In short, everything was pleasing to the eye. Bai Shuali sat down and looked at him a few more times. Yi Mulin put down the newspaper and looked at her. What's wrong? Bai Shuali pursed her lips and began to eat. Nothing much. I just feel that you've been dressing rather coquettishly recently. You weren't so particular before. In the past, he always wore a classic black and white shirt and suit. He rarely used things like cufflinks, and his tie was more old-fashioned than it was now. Hearing her say this, or more accurately, complain, he smiled. Shouldn't married men tidy themselves up? Making your wife happy is also a kind of obligation. Bai Shuali was still biting her lips and staring at him. Actually, he was the kind of man who didn't need a woman except in bed. He knew how to cook, and he also took care of his appearance. On the other hand, she was the one who needed to be taken care of. She didn't know anything, and her only contribution was to make him happy in bed. But now he said he was making her happy. Bai Shuali lowered her head and did not speak. Yi Mulin's gaze softened. Are you still angry that I didn't come back earlier to accompany you yesterday? She shook her head. Or you don't like the gift I bought you? He smiled. I'm just trying to make you happy. If you don't like it, I'll bring you along next time. Didn't you say you wanted to go to Milan? Fashion week is over. What's the point of going? She said in a low voice as she took a big bite of rice. Yi Mulin looked straight at her. Then what do you want, Shuali? She looked up at him sharply. He looked at her with a smile, and there was a depth in his eyes that she could not understand. She stood there in a daze. After looking at each other for a long time, he reached out and gently rubbed her hair, whispering, I'm right here. Okay? Her gaze was straighter. He smiled and lowered his head to eat. After eating, she washed the dishes before leaving. When she left, Bai Shuali sat on the sofa in a daze. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. I'll be back soon. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes. He smiled again and reached out to ruffle her hair. He was very busy. He said that he would come back early, but he couldn't do it. However, he gave her a call. Oh, she said. She didn't go out and ate the leftovers from lunch. That night, she slept alone. When she woke up, it was already midnight. He hasn't come back yet. She sat up and stared at the time in a daze. She thought about what he had said. He was there, but he was standing so far away, so high, she might not be able to reach him in her lifetime. She bent over and hugged herself. He couldn't tell if he was feeling sorry for himself, or if he found himself ridiculous. If he didn't come back for one night, she would sit in bed all night. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, there was some movement outside the door. She moved. Yi Mulin walked in and was surprised to see her sitting on the bed. Then he said in a stern voice, Bai Shuali, who allowed you to sit here all night? She looked at him blankly. I just woke up. He obviously didn't believe her. He walked over and bent down to look at her eyes carefully. She turned away and bit her lip. You didn't sleep last night either. Chapter 34:18. She raised her head and looked at him. What's the difference? She looked at him. She was very fragile. Yi Mulin smiled lightly and sat on the bed to rub her hair. Men are more resistant to aging. But you're 8 years older than me. She looked at him without moving and stabbed him. Yi Mulin smiled lightly and didn't say anything. He just lay down, threw his coat aside and rubbed his eyebrows. I'm exhausted. This was actually a man's trick. Some women wouldn't fall for it. However, Bai Shuali's understanding as a man was limited to her stamp collection and Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai was actually a bottomless pit. How could she see it clearly? Yi Mulin wasn't the one who understood it the most. But it was useless. Compared to Lawyer Yi, she was just a noob. Lying down like this in pain, her heart softened. She looked at him and asked, Did you work overtime? He closed his eyes. After hearing her words, he smiled lightly and opened his eyes to look at her. He pulled her into his arms. I went to find a woman. She immediately fell into his arms. There was a unique smell of tobacco on his body. There was also some smell of unwashed body, which meant that he had been soaking in tobacco for the whole night. There was absolutely no smell of perfume. Sensing that she was sniffing around his body like a puppy, Yi Mulin smiled lightly. He closed his eyes again and rubbed her little face into his arms, almost suffocating her. When she was struggling, he said, "I told the secretary not to put on perfume." Baishuali was stunned for a moment. Then, she raised her head and looked at him blankly. He also looked at her. After a while, she said in a low voice, "So you mean that in the future, the perfume on your body will belong to another woman and not the secretary's, right? There won't be anyone else." He hugged her sideways as if he was hugging a pillow. "Baishuali is exhausted to sleep now. It's hard to raise you, so I have to work extra hard." She didn't know why, but his words were sweet and sour. They also went into her ears. The unwillingness and grievances in her heart had almost disappeared. She admitted that she had no backbone and returned to his side so easily. In fact, she was still unhappy and unwilling, but she couldn't refuse. The feeling of wandering outside was not good. She carefully leaned against him and rested her face on his shoulder. "Will you drive me away again?" Yi Mulin frowned slightly and looked at her. "When did I chase you away?" "You're chasing me away by flirting with AI Wei," she protested in a low voice. She had just finished speaking when he slapped her butt. "You were hugging Gu Chongfeng in front of me." When he thought of this, he was filled with anger. He pinched her face so hard that it was almost deformed. It was very cruel. "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Her eyes were brimming with tears as she repeatedly said. Yi Mulin saw that she was well-behaved and obedient, so he let go of her, but he still snorted twice. Baishuali bit her lip and buried herself in his arms, poking his chest with her little hand. "If you don't take a shower, you stink. Stop fooling around." He grabbed her little hand and pulled it to an indescribable place. "If you mess around again, I'll do it a few more times and you'll be obedient." She didn't dare to say anything more, for fear that his animal nature would be triggered. She obediently stayed in his arms. Probably because she was obedient, his voice was much gentler. "Baishuali, be good. I'll stay with you, okay? I don't want you to stay with me." She turned her back. Chapter 34:19. She bit her lips. "I just don't want you to accompany me." He was silent for a long time. She thought that he was angry and did not say anything either. He was angry, but she was too. She did not come back for the entire night. She silently fumed and played with her fingers. She was very tired and sleepy, but she just couldn't fall asleep. Yi Mulin hugged her waist with one hand and leaned his face over. "But I want to accompany you." Her body trembled. She lowered her eyes and cried silently. He knew that she was crying and whispered, "It's my fault. I shouldn't have worked overtime. I should have come back earlier." Rice Worm did not say anything. She turned her head and hugged his waist, throwing herself into his embrace. She hugged him tightly and felt wronged. She was not wrong, but she felt that she was useless. She liked him, and so she threw a tantrum because she knew that they were not good enough for each other. He had so many tricks up his sleeve, and he could use his ex-girlfriend completely. She was afraid. She was afraid that he would do the same to her one day. That was something even scarier than him playing around outside. She was unhappy because she tasted feelings outside of money. "Yi Mulin, I'm scared. So scared that I don't dare to stay by your side." She tried her best to control herself, but she could not help but break down and cry. What did she do wrong? She was fine and had the most stable life. She chased after every man she liked, and if she didn't like them, she threw them aside. She could use her family's power to force her favorite, Mu Bai, to marry her, but she married Mu Bai's brother. She hated him, but she could not help but like him. Only after liking him did she realize how ridiculous she was and how unworthy she was. If AI Wei hadn't shown up, she would have enjoyed his love and his money. However, AI Wei appeared and slapped her hard in the face and woke her up. So, she and Yi Mulin had been living in two different worlds. All her mischief, all her unhappiness, and all her leaving were because she was afraid and did not dare to face it. She cried like a child, confused and a little cute. Yi Mulin was actually very tired, but he had to comfort his little wife when she was crying so hard. He gently caressed her little head and said softly, I remember a few months ago, you told me, Emulin, you like me, right? She looked up and accidentally bumped his chin. With a look of patience on his face, he pushed her away a little and said with some disdain, Actually, I really don't want to like you when you're so stupid. But there's no other way. Liking you is liking you. Liking was liking. Her eyes gently blinked once. Somewhat did not dare to believe what he said. Was this a confession? Emulin looked at her silly look and smiled. He took the wallet from the bedside table and threw it into her arms. See for yourself. She was a little confused and asked, Did you get me another card with no upper limit? It's only been 2 days, and you're showing your true colors again? He said in disdain, Didn't you say you don't like money? I still like it, but I don't like it intermittently. Don't take it seriously. She stuck out her tongue and opened his wallet. After opening it, she was stunned. There was a picture neatly clipped in the wallet. It was a very familiar picture, because it was herself. Chapter 34:20. She blinked and looked at him in disbelief. Yi Mulin. Lawyer Yi closed his eyes and put his hands behind his head. I don't know what was wrong with me at that time. Bai Shuili looked at the photo and coughed. You have good taste. But Yi Mulin, how old was I at that time? I was only 16 or 17. You are such a beast. He opened his eyes and sneered at her. That's because you have had 3 or 4 boyfriends. You are still chasing after Mubai all the time. I feel embarrassed for you. Then why do you still like me? She said with a bit of joy. Yi Mulin closed his eyes again. I have bad taste. She put down her wallet reluctantly and crawled to his side. She asked in a low voice, Then why are you still with Ai Wei? He grabbed her arm and pulled her into his arms. Don't ask. I won't answer even if you ask. She bit her lower lip and smiled. She lay in his arms and said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, have you been secretly in love with me for a long time? Shut up. He said coldly, Go to sleep. But his little wife got up and pulled her pajamas. Didn't you say that if I don't behave, you will do it a few times? Do you still mean it? Yi Mulin was about to fall asleep. He stared at her and said, Bai Shuili, can you be more reserved? You are blind. She said confidently, Shouldn't we celebrate today so that we can leave a deeper impression? Yi Mulin looked at her and asked softly, Do you really want to do it a few times? Are you not afraid of the pain? She nodded and moved into his arms. Bai Shuili, you're really good at messing around, he said, almost at the end of his patience. You said you would accompany me, she said softly and blinked her eyes. Yi Mulin stared at her and suddenly pulled her closer. He kissed her lips roughly. Then everything was rough. He only stopped after violently beating her up several times until there was not a single bone left and she did not even have the strength to scream. Before Bai Shuili went to sleep, she secretly thought to herself that she would never listen to his confession in the future. Once he confessed, she would die of exhaustion. It still hurts. At his age, he didn't even know how to restrain himself. She grumbled and fell asleep. She slept soundly. No matter what, Yi Mulin couldn't sleep straight away. He carried her to the bathroom and took a quick shower. They couldn't sleep on the bed in the master bedroom, so he brought her to the guest room. However, the young lady said she couldn't sleep and wanted to sleep in the master bedroom. He pinched her chin and said fiercely, I really want to throw you out to sleep on the street. I know you can't bear to. You've liked me for so long. She lay in his arms and giggled, but then she closed her eyes in exhaustion. He was so angry that he raised his hand to hit her butt, but when he saw how badly she was beaten up by him, he raised his hand high and then gently put it down again. Bai Shuili lay in his arms and smiled faintly. He had no choice but to carry her to the master bedroom to change the bedsheets. The original one really couldn't be used. Today had been crazy, and he didn't use that one, so it was everywhere. Even Yi Mulin felt that it was lustful and ridiculous. The worm was still in his arms. He had to carry her with one hand and change the bedsheets with the other. After that, he felt that he had lost 2 years of his life. He complained after lying down. She snuggled in his arms and said in a daze, "Who asked you to not come back for one night? If you don't come back again, I'll do the same to you." All the loneliness and helplessness in Yi Mulin's heart were soothed by her words. Chapter 34:21. He looked down at the worm in his arms and smiled. "Okay." She fell asleep for a while and suddenly opened her eyes. "It seems like you got lucky." He pinched her face and said in a low voice, "I'm so tired." She hugged his waist childishly and said, "I thought you didn't know how to be tired." Emulin closed his eyes. "Shueli, I'm also a human, an ordinary man." She replied with an "oh" and didn't say anything else. When he tried to look down at her, she was fast asleep, sound asleep. Emulin chuckled softly and hugged her to sleep. Emulin decided to rest for a day because of the clingy little thing at home. So when Bai Shueli woke up in the afternoon, she saw that he was still there. Her eyes were wide open. Emulin was dressed neatly and looked as pleasant as usual. It seemed that he had been up for a long time. She woke up. He immediately bent over and bit her face. "You're awake." She grunted and looked at him. He smiled. "I made breakfast. Do you want to get up by yourself, or do you want me to carry you?" She lay on the bed softly and rubbed her head against the white pillow. It was very soft. He looked at her and made the decision for her. He carried her to the bathroom and put her down. "Wash your face and brush your teeth. Go out quickly. Otherwise, I'll think that you're seducing me." After saying that, he walked to the door briskly. Bai Shueli stopped him from behind. "I'm not as unreasonable as you, okay?" He turned around and said tolerantly, "When I came back from working overnight, there was a little girl who pestered me to do it 3 times. Bai Shueli, do you think this little girl is unreasonable?" She blushed and waved her hand. "Go out. I'll be right out." He chuckled and turned to go out. Bai Shueli brushed her teeth in front of the mirror. Her mind was a little far away. Emulin seemed to have changed into a different person. What was he thinking? She cleaned herself up and walked out. When she sat down to eat, Emulin said softly, "Shueli, we want to have a child." She bit the sandwich and looked at him. "Didn't you say that I can't take care of myself and it's not suitable now?" He smiled. "I don't care about the 2 of you." She did not make a sound, silently biting into her sandwich. His voice was very gentle. "I'm almost 35, and we've been married for a few months. Isn't it normal to have a child now? Or you don't want to bear my child?" She suddenly felt that the sandwich in her hand didn't taste good anymore. After taking a bite, she put it down and said softly, "I haven't thought about it yet." He reached out and held her hand. "I understand that you are uncertain about our marriage, but surely, a child can really make a family more stable. What I want most is not a child, but a stable marriage with you." She looked at him and bit her lip after a while. "Don't use your tricks on me." He chuckled softly. "Actually, I'm not stupid." Bai Shueli lowered her head. After a while, she whispered, "It's not like that. The order is wrong." He looked at her quietly, knowing that those who should come would come. No matter what, she did not know how to do anything. But as he said, she was not stupid. She would always know what she wanted. Bai Shueli looked at him and said slowly, "You want me and our child, but I haven't decided to spend the rest of my life with you. Are you trying to tie me down with the child now?" After saying that, she stared at him. Emulin was silent for a while and smiled. "You're really not stupid." She blinked. Did he admit it? Bai Shueli couldn't believe it. When she looked at him again, he was already eating very elegantly. "After eating, I'll take you back to the old house. My mother has asked me to take you back several times. She said that you've lost a lot of weight and I didn't take good care of you." She still looked at him. Suddenly, she put down the sandwich in her hand and ran back to the room. After a while, when she ran back, her little face was red. He looked at her. "What's wrong?" Bai Shueli bit her lip and hesitated for a while before asking, "This morning, did you use a condom?" Lawyer Yi kindly asked for her, and then saw his little wife's face turn a little redder. She didn't say anything and just looked at him. He slowly wiped his lower lip and looked up at her. I forgot that you climbed into my arms and asked for it this morning. You begged me like that. How could I think of condoms? Baishuali was furious. You did it on purpose. Mrs. Yi, you need evidence. He kindly reminded her. And today you took the initiative. If you are pregnant with a child that I didn't expect, to some extent, I am also a victim. She stared at him. He was really shameless to the extreme, vividly displaying the true face of a lawyer. Chapter 34:22. Baishuali glared at him. But it was useless. Lawyer Yi was shockingly thick-skinned. After the meal, he urged her to change her clothes and made some tea outside. When he was not busy, he was actually a man who knew how to enjoy himself. After drinking 2 cups of tea, the rice worm still hadn't come out. He got up and walked into the bedroom, only to see the one who was supposed to change her clothes lying on the bed and playing with her phone. He went over and took the phone from her hand and looked at her. Didn't you say you were going back to the old house? Why are you still playing with your phone? As he said that, he swiped her phone a few times and looked at her. How old are you? You're still playing with this? Why can't I play with it? She looked at him. He sat over and leaned against the head of the bed. Then he looked at her. You're going to be a mother. You can read books and drink tea. It sounds like the life of an old woman, she said uninterestedly. And I didn't say I want to be a mother. Don't add to the drama. He laughed. What if we have one this morning? She looked at him, her eyes a little wide. He did the same. He stared straight at her, not letting go of her expression. Baishuali bit her lower lip. What if we really have one? He still didn't say anything. She threw herself into the bed and snorted. I don't care. I don't want to give birth. He wasn't angry when she said that because he knew she wouldn't. He leaned over and said in a low voice, You don't like children? It's a little annoying. She looked at him. If you want a child, you can give birth yourself. He smiled and pulled her into his arms with one hand. I'll take care of you after you give birth. I'm sure you'll be healthy and chubby. I've already lost weight. How can the child be healthy and chubby? She looked at him doubtfully. Besides, you're so busy. Forget it. She looked disinterested and lay down lazily again. Yimulin said in a low voice, You don't believe me? I don't believe you. She stuck out her tongue. He didn't argue with her too much. Instead, he dragged her up. Okay, go change your clothes. We'll talk about the child later. She couldn't argue with him, so she went to change her clothes. Since she was going back to the Yi residence, she changed into a more ladylike outfit. It was a Chanel suit and a limited edition handbag that Lawyer Yi had bought. Yi Mulin tilted his head to look at her and coughed softly. Why aren't you wearing the ring? She looked down at her empty fingers and smiled faintly. I'm not used to wearing it. I'm afraid I'll drop it. He looked at her, took a ring out of his pocket, held her hand, and put it on for her. She looked up at him and he smiled. You're not leaving, huh? She didn't say anything and clenched her fingers. She felt that it was swollen. It should be because she hadn't worn the ring for a long time, right? It was almost 4 o'clock when he took her downstairs. In the car, she sat next to him and gently stroked the diamond ring with her fingers. Yimulin did not speak to her but directly started the car. After a while, she found that the car did not drive to the Yi house, but to Intai Square. Buy some gifts. He looked at her and said softly, Tell me, how long has it been since you last visited Mom? She even washed your clothes for you. Baishuali nodded and went down with him to stroll around. Chapter 34:23. Yimulin walked into a boutique. Let's get a set of coffee cups. My father likes coffee. Baishuali couldn't understand. This is for your mother. Why do we have to look at your father's preferences? He picked up an exquisite cup and looked at her with a smile. After a long time, he asked softly, Shuali, you really don't understand? She was confused. Understand what? He smiled, put down the cup in his hand and picked up another one. All his actions were pleasing to the eye. Bai Shuali looked at him with envy. He picked carefully because he didn't dare to have the same taste as her, so she stayed by his side. Later, because she was bored and tired, she hugged his arm gently and put half of her body weight on him. He turned his head and asked softly, "Tired?" She nodded and rested her face on his shoulder, listening to the shop assistant talking to him. He listened very patiently and would look at her later to ask for her opinion. She wasn't very interested. "I'm not particular about this. Instant is fine. But I like it," he said and went to talk to someone else. Bai Shuali sobered up a little and looked at him again. She thought she understood what he meant before. Why did he have to buy his mother a gift that his father liked? In the end, he was the one who decided and took 2 sets. "Why 2 sets? Does your father like to smash cups at home?" She looked at him. Immerse paid. "We'll keep 1 for ourselves." She nodded and walked out with him. She thought they were going to leave immediately. However, after he put the gift box in the trunk, he looked at his watch. "It's still early. Let's shop for a while more." She was embarrassed. "Immerse, what's wrong with you today? Didn't you say that I won't accompany you?" He smiled and held her hand as they walked towards the elevator. Her heart skipped a beat and she didn't come back to her senses for a long time. When they got into the elevator, she wanted to break free from his hand. He didn't let go and wanted to move away a little. Suddenly, a large group of people rushed into the elevator, filling it up. Bai Shuali could only stand beside him obediently. The 2 men in front of her squeezed over. She bit her lip and felt very uncomfortable. Just then, taking her hand, he gave it a little tug, and she fell instantly into his arms. Her face was pressed against his chest, and her nose was filled with the pleasant scent of his tobacco. His arms were hugging her, preventing her from coming into contact with anyone else. It wasn't that she hadn't hugged him before. They had stripped naked countless times, but there had never been a moment like this. There had never been a moment where she felt so close to him. They were husband and wife, they were very close. He would stand in front of her at any time. Her body was a little stiff at first, but she slowly softened her body and let herself stick to his embrace. His palm landed on her back, gently stroking back and forth as a form of comfort. Bai Shuali was suddenly possessed by a baby. Her slender arms wrapped around his waist and hugged him tightly. After a long time, his deep voice came from above. "Bai Shuali, how much longer do you want to hug me?" Startled, she looked up. The elevator had already arrived, and there was no one inside. She looked at him. "Lawyer," he said slowly. "When the elevator door opened, everyone stared at you for more than 3 seconds, including your perverted hand." She exploded. "I didn't." But very quickly, she realized that he had let go of her long ago. At this moment, she was hugging him tightly with a face full of infatuation. Chapter 34-24. Bai Shuali stared at herself in the mirror. Then, she bounced away and hit the wall behind her. It hurt so much that tears welled up in her eyes. Immerse reached out and pulled her into his arms. He gently rubbed the back of her head. His voice was low and husky. "How can you be a mother if you are so careless? You always talk about having children. If you want to have children, find someone else to do it for you." She rolled her eyes at him. As Immerse rubbed it for her, he kindly explained to her, "According to the law, only spouses can mate and give birth to legitimate offspring." Bai Shuali stared at him. "Copulate." Immerse smiled slightly. "Isn't that right? According to the law, only with a certificate can you have the legal right to copulate." She still stared at him. Animal. Her head no longer hurt. She walked out and walked in front. Immerse followed behind her. After a while, he dragged her to his side. She looked at him and bit her lower lip. She still held his arm and leaned against him as if she had no bones. He looked at her sideways and didn't say anything. Bai Shuali looked at an LV store in front of them and said softly, "Let's go there and have a look." Immerse looked at her and then at the store. "You want to buy a bag?" She didn't seem to like this brand. She usually liked pink and girls' products. Bai Shuali didn't say anything. she just dragged him in. However, she didn't look at the bag. Instead, she looked at the scarf. Yimulin saw that she took a black and gray cashmere scarf. He understood what she meant and smiled slightly. Bai Shuali gestured to herself in the mirror and then glanced at him. You bought the coffee cup and I bought this for Mom. When she said the word mother, in a slightly childish tone, Yimulin felt an indescribable warmth in his heart. She was actually very simple. No matter how much she quarreled with him, she still respected his mother very much. Does it look good? Rice Worm tilted his head. It's warm and comfortable. He smiled. It's pretty good. She seemed to be dissatisfied with his answer. She screamed, What do you mean it's pretty good? It's obviously pretty good, okay? You men only know how to do useless things. As a woman, a gift that is worn on her body is more considerate. As she spoke, she even gestured on his body. Is it comfortable? Actually, she didn't mean to ask. It was just a simple chat. But just as she finished speaking, Yimulin held her waist and pulled her closer. His voice was low and husky. Comfortable. She was stunned for a moment before realizing that he was taking advantage of her. She bit her lips. Yimulin. He smiled and let go of her. He took a pink scarf from the side and handed it to the shop assistant. Wrap this up too. She watched him make the payment and whispered, Is Mom suitable? This is for my wife. He looked at her. Then, the rice worm's little face turned red. He smiled, picked up the bag and walked in front. Rice Worm immediately followed. I didn't say I liked it. Didn't I say that the gift has to be worn on the body? He held her hand. It looks good on you. It should be very comfortable, right? The rice worm's face turned even redder. Yimulin was definitely the most indecent lawyer. Chapter 34-25. When they reached a toy shop, Bai Shuali couldn't walk anymore. She saw a Mimi rabbit, which was quite cute. Yimulin walked in front of her. When he realized that she didn't follow him, he turned his head and looked at her. She was looking at the rabbit and couldn't move her eyes away. To be honest, he never thought that his little wife liked these things. She should like shiny jewelry. That was why women were complicated. He walked back and didn't ask for the price. He took it and went to pay the bill. After that, he threw it into her arms. It's for you. Bai Shuali looked disgusted. Who asked you to buy it? I'm not that childish. He looked at her, paused for a moment and looked around. Then he coughed. If you don't like it, give it to that little girl. As he said that, he wanted to take it back from her arms and give it to a 10-year-old child. Rice Worm was anxious and hugged it tightly. Why do you have to give it to someone else? I didn't say that I don't like it. Don't you think it's childish? He looked at her. She snorted. You're the childish one to argue with me. She hugged the little rabbit angrily and walked forward. That awkward look on her face was very pleasing to him. In fact, Bai Shuali was like this when she was young. She was always awkward in front of him and didn't say much. She was eloquent in front of Mu Bai, but Mu Bai didn't appreciate it. She was walking in front of him, her hips swaying. He found it funny to see her. She didn't grow up. He followed behind her and asked kindly, Have you thought of a name yet? Big White? Bai Shuali snorted. Yimulin. He made a long O sound. Then, do you want to hug it to sleep at night? Bai Shuali stopped and turned her head. Yimulin, can you not take advantage of me all day long? He looked at her and smiled flirtatiously. You took the initiative this morning. Moreover, we are legally married and have the legal right to mate and have children. If I don't take advantage of you, who else should I look for? She stomped her feet and ran away. After a while, she ran back because she went the wrong way. This time, she let him walk in front while she followed him with the rabbit. It was still awkward. After walking for a while, Yimulin suddenly grabbed her and placed her in the crook of his arm. Let's go together. I'll be worried if I don't keep an eye on you. She bit her lip and said stubbornly, I can't even walk properly. He just smiled and didn't want to argue with her. The people around them looked at their awkward expressions, but they felt that it was so sweet that the air was tinged with sour water. When they arrived at the car, it was already 5:30 p.m. When they drove back to the Yi house, it was 6 p.m. dinner time. In the car, he kindly told her, "Today is my mother's birthday, but it's not a grand celebration. We only invited friends and relatives. We set up 4 tables and held it in the old house. There's no buffet, just a meal." Her eyes widened, but he said lightly and continued to drive. Bai Shuili held her breath. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" "What's the difference between saying it earlier or later? We bought a present." He was still looking forward. "Give her your present later. My mother will be very happy." Bai Shuili was still unhappy. "The whole world knows about our divorce. So now, let others know that we're fine." He was still calm. She held her breath. "Is this the purpose of this banquet?" Her defensiveness made him a little uncomfortable. He controlled the steering wheel with one hand and held her hand with the other. "Shuili, don't see everything so utilitarian. It's just a family banquet. Don't you want to go?" Chapter 34:26. She looked at him, pursed her lips, and said nothing. He put his elbows on the steering wheel, and his expression was gentle. "If you don't want to go, I'll send you back to the apartment." Then he sighed. "But my mom might be very sad. She loves you very much, you know." Bai Shuili looked at him eagerly. He smiled and didn't force her. Instead, he reached out and gently rubbed her hair. "What about now? Do you still insist on going back to the apartment?" She looked up at him. "Yi Mulin, do you look down on me? If you don't go, coward, I'll despise you." He smiled slightly, and his smile was very beautiful. "I'll go back and teach you a lesson. Because if I go alone, I'll lose face." Her eyes slightly widened. He smiled. "You have a wife, but you still go home alone like Mubai. Don't you think you'll lose face?" She still looked at him. He sighed. "I'll send you back." As he spoke, he started the car, but the worm hurriedly grabbed onto his arm. He looked at her. Bai Shuili's voice was very low. "Didn't you buy the gift?" He smiled. "Do you mean to go to the old house?" She didn't say anything, and she quickly turned her face to the side. She was sulking. She didn't know whether she was angry at him or herself. Yimulin chuckled. He didn't say anything and started the car. It was only at the red light that he would hold her hand when he was free. In the beginning, our little worm would throw him away in disgust, but he would still hold her hand. After a long time, she was too lazy to throw him away, but her little face slowly turned red. When they arrived at the Yi house, she sat in the car and saw many cars parked there. They were all famous cars, but the models were very low-key. Her father's car was also there. She looked at Yi Mulin. He slowly unfastened the seat belt. "Afraid? My dad. He's very unhappy because of us," she said softly. Yi Mulin smiled. "He'll be happy if we come back together." He opened the door and was about to get out. Seeing that she was still sitting there without a backbone, he sighed. "I'm here, what are you afraid of?" Bai Shuili said, and then pouted. "Help me open the door." He smiled. "If you want, I can carry you in." She let out a strange cry and immediately opened the door to get out of the car. When the two little ones walked into the night house together, they naturally attracted a lot of care. After all, the previous incident was too unseemly. It was rumored that they had separated, but outsiders had no way of knowing whether it was true or not. The Yi clan's eldest brother had always been serious. Who would dare to care about his private life? But at this moment, eldest brother Ye's usually stern face was filled with gentleness. He held his wife's hand and walked across the luxurious and bright hall until they reached Father Yi and Mother Yi. Yi Mulin put down his coffee cup and looked at his little wife. Bai Shuili held the bag of scarves and looked at Mama Yi eagerly. "Mom, happy birthday." Mama Yi was wearing a cheongsam tonight. It was a little cold, so she took out her scarf and put it on. Then, she patted Bai Shuili's head and said, "You're so considerate. Unlike the cold things that Mulin and Mubai gave you. I knew at a glance that they were cups. There are almost 100 sets at home, and he still bought them. I really don't understand what these men are thinking. Chapter 34:27. Bai Shuali didn't have any pockets, so she left her bag in the car and put it in Yi Mulin's pocket. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. Accompany Mom to socialize. She nodded and was about to go over when Mama Yi smiled. Let Shirley accompany you. Mama Yi came over and patted her eldest son's shoulder. You look like you can't leave your wife. She teased her eldest son like that, and Yi Mulin agreed. Bai Shuali became shy and hugged Mama Ye's arm. I'll accompany Mom. Mama Yi patted her and Bai Shuali's mother came over. Mama Yi smiled. Look at Shirley. She's so spoiled. Mama Bai came over and patted her daughter's head. You have to teach her well. She doesn't know anything. Mama Yi smiled. That's good. Yi Mulin can love his wife. They talked and drank like that. There were many friends and relatives around them. Bai Shuali couldn't stand it. She secretly looked at Yi Mulin, hoping that he would save her. Yi Mulin looked at her with a smile. Finally, he found his conscience and dragged her over. He smiled. I'll bring Shirley to the table. She hasn't eaten anything today and she's hungry. Mama Yi and Mama Bai looked at each other and smiled. They were relieved to see their son and daughter being so loving. However, even though it was a family banquet, it was still a high-class meal. It was a French meal after all. Whatever liver or sauce was not enough. Hence, when they left the Yi house, Bai Shuali turned her head sideways and asked, Yi Mulin, don't you think that tonight's meal was a little small? He started the car and looked at her. Is it? It's always like this. Don't you like French food? Bai Shuali replied with an "oh" and then said softly, actually, other than French cuisine and these high-class dishes, Chinese food and even midnight snacks are also very delicious. Yi Mulin, don't you want to try? He looked at her. She put her little hand into his pocket. Mom, didn't you give me a red packet? I have money. I'll treat you. He focused on driving and said very slowly, did you think of coming out for supper when you were eating dinner? Then he tilted his head. You've been away from home for a period of time, and you've completely become wild. Wild little white? She asked him with a smile. Yi Mulin looked at her approaching face from the corner of his eye, and her smiling face. His heart skipped a beat. Without saying anything, he slowly stopped the car by the roadside. After a soft sound, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her. She stared at him with wide eyes. She wanted to speak, but every word was forced into his mouth and swallowed. She obediently allowed him to kiss her, her little hands quietly hugging his waist. After a long time, he released her and licked his lips. The taste of caviar. She kissed him. Do you want to taste the barbecue later? Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. Are you really hungry? She nodded vigorously. I haven't eaten much today. After saying that, she stared straight at him, her eyes full of desire. Yi Mulin thought for a moment and suddenly said, I'm hungry too. His eyes were so clear that she only took a few seconds to understand what he meant by hungry. She stammered, didn't we do it in the morning? He sighed and reached out to stroke her hair. You've been hungry for a long time. Chapter 34:28. She looked up at him and then her face turned red. She bit her lips and said, You asked for it. His eyes were still staring at her and his voice was low and husky. If I don't ask for it now, will you not starve me again? What? She leaned her head against the back of the seat and looked at him in a daze. Yi Mulin took a step forward and stretched out his hand. She screamed even louder. What are you doing? He buckled her seat belt and chuckled. Going to eat barbecue. The one we went to last time? She nodded and stared at his face as if she couldn't believe that he would let her go so easily. Yi Mulin reached out and rubbed her head. What are you thinking about? Car Z again. No, you only have 1 minute in the car. She looked at him with a mischievous look in her eyes. Cece saw it from upstairs that day. Yi Mulin chuckled as he drove. Then did you tell her that your husband usually goes up for more than an hour? She turned her head and ignored him. Shameless. He looked at her side profile and smiled. He drove the car to the door of the shop where he found her last time. The car was parked at the place where their car Z was. No matter how stupid she was, she could sense his bad intentions. When she unfastened the seatbelt, she looked at him. Do you want to savor the feeling of 1 minute? He pinched her face. It's not that boring. Why would I care about an aperitif when there's a big meal? He paused and became serious. Actually, I prefer to do this kind of thing on the bed. Or the bathroom is fine. The car is too small. Bai Shueli blushed. Yimulin, can't you let me have a good meal? He smiled and got out of the car. When he was about to open the door for her, she had already jumped out. He shook his head and sat down behind her. He watched her order food skillfully. This was a very cheap shop. They looked a little out of place. Moreover, most of the people eating here were young girls in their early 20s. Yimulin took out his phone and checked the messages for a while. He dealt with some urgent matters and then waited patiently for his wife to order food. Watching her say a long list, he couldn't help but look at his watch. It's almost 10 o'clock. Can you eat so much? She rolled her eyes at him. That's why it's called supper. Yimulin smiled and did not say anything else. He had been very gentle. The young ladies around him all looked at him and secretly pointed at him. Firstly, he was good-looking, and secondly, he exuded a cold, noble, and elite temperament from head to toe. This kind of man was especially popular these days. Yimulin didn't notice it and didn't care. Rice Worm, who had just finished ordering, saw it. He bit his lower lip and said, "Attracting bees and butterflies." He looked at her, then looked around and chuckled. Jealous? Why would I? You're still under observation. If you don't feel well, I'll still leave. Rice Worm gently flipped his hair and said in a muffled voice, "My appetite isn't very good anymore. Yimulin, why are you so hateful?" She tugged at his sleeve petulantly. If he was a little uglier and didn't have such a good temperament, he wouldn't be able to attract young girls like this. That was how Ai Wei was recruited by him. Yimulin chuckled. Then, does that mean you won't be interested in me? She glared at him. I don't really like you right now. Chapter 34-29. Bai Shueli ignored him and took out her phone to look at the entertainment news. Even though it wasn't nutritious, it was enough to entertain her. Yimulin used to say that she was shallow, and she showed him how shallow she was. How could he not know what she was thinking? He drank the cheap oolong tea. He wasn't used to the taste of it in the past, but now, it was still passable. After a while, the waiter came over with the roasted meat. He looked at Bai Shueli. Can you finish it? Rice Worm looked at him strangely and said slowly, This is only half. He laughed. She then added, Don't I still have you? Yimulin's expression was indifferent, but he still ate with her. Bai Shueli's mouth was stuffed full, and she asked him while eating, Isn't it delicious? It tastes really good, right? Yimulin nodded. Yes, it's okay. Rice Worm was so satisfied that her eyes were curved. She ate with one hand and took a roasted lamb chop for him. This is good, try it. He took it and seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then, he smiled lightly and said, Okay. Bai Shueli looked at him and smiled too. She then focused on eating. She would give him a skewer from time to time, and he would give her 2 skewers too. After a while, the boss would bring over a huge plate. He glared at her. Can you finish it? Look at how much you've already eaten. Bai Shueli stuck out her tongue. Her slender fingers were a little greasy as she reached out to grab it. Yimulin helped her share the burden helplessly. In the end, he really finished it all. He was a little surprised himself. When he paid the bill, it was more than 800 yuan. He paid, and that rice worm hugged his arm in satisfaction while rubbing her tummy. I used to live at Cece's house, and I could only eat such a big meal every 3 days. I've been thinking about it for a long time. He was a little helpless, but also a little sad. He turned his head and warned her, You're not allowed to have a stomachache with me when we get back. Her face blushed and she hugged his arm, pressing her face against his. Through his shirt, she could feel the warmth of his body. It was so comfortable that she wanted to sleep. After Yi Mulin paid, he half-hugged and half-carried her into the car. She was sleepy, but his car drove smoothly. When they arrived at his apartment, it was already midnight. The apartment was especially quiet except for the occasional sound of Xiao Bai. He put his arm around her and walked into the bedroom, feeling a little smug. The rice worm woke up and made a fuss about going to see Little White first, but he stopped it. Using the momentum, she fell into his arms. There was a faint smell of tobacco and barbecued meat on his body. Smelled good. She raised her little face and bit his neck, saying stupidly, "I'm not full yet." He put his hand around her waist and pulled her into his arms. His voice was low and hoarse. "I'll let you eat, okay?" "No way." She buried her whole body in his arms, but after a while, she sniffed here and there. He pressed down on her little head and pulled her hair up. His voice was hoarse. "I'm not full either. I've been hungry for a long time." As he spoke, he kissed her. It wasn't a deep kiss, but a light peck at the corner of her lips, touching her soft skin bit by bit. Chapter 34:30. His body was mixed with many kinds of smells. It was very charming. He turned into the most superior village medicine, spring medicine, teasing her. She took the initiative to accept the mellow red wine. Then, she felt that it was not enough. She kicked off her high heels and stood on his leather shoes with her bare feet, two slender arms wrapped around his neck. When the kiss ended, he whispered at the corner of her mouth, "Do you want more?" She bit his lips and snorted. He picked up the red wine bottle with a low smile and took another sip. This time, he directly sealed her lips. This time, he pushed her to the soft bed. She lay on the pillow. Her hair was messy and very tempting. At least, it was a temptation that Yi Mulin could not bear. The kiss became more and more lingering. Their fingers intertwined. She had long been confused and infatuated, but he just had to whisper at such a time, "Call my name." Rice Worm opened her eyes and stared at him in a daze. Her red lips slightly opened and her voice was hoarse. "Yi Mulin, what's wrong with you?" He bit her hard. Something's wrong. She was being teased by him. She was waiting for the important moment to come, but he was being unreasonable. She kicked him angrily. "Yi Mulin, are you a man?" He chuckled delightedly and wanted to tease her. "If you call me the right one, I'll give it to you and make you feel good. Okay?" She bit her lips and stared at him. "Yi Mulin, you're a jerk." She kicked him a few times to vent her anger. But when did Lawyer Yi fail to get what he wanted? Not only did he not give it to her, but he also tortured her even more. Bai Shuali was tortured badly by him. In the end, she turned her face to the side. Her fair face was dyed with a layer of seductive color. She called softly, "Husband." The next second, Lawyer Yi did what she wanted. He was very strong and also very cruel. Yi Mulin had handled countless large-scale divorce cases. They were all big shots and wives. He had heard those women call their unfaithful husbands husband, with tears in their eyes. He used to think that the word was disdainful and belonged to a resentful woman. But at this moment, when it came from her little mouth, he was so excited that he could not control himself. He wanted her to call him Mulin, but she called him husband, under the heat of passion. It was natural for them to be very powerful. They also looked like newlyweds who had not seen each other for a long time. She was very obedient, hugging him obediently and doing whatever he wanted her to do. As a man, he was unprecedentedly satisfied. It wasn't until 3 o'clock in the morning that he finally hugged her to take a quick shower and lay down together. However, when he was lying down, he felt that something was wrong. His stomach felt uncomfortable, but he didn't mind it. He hugged his wife and closed his eyes. The little wife in his arms had already fallen asleep. In the darkness, there was only the soft sound of Little White crawling around. He laughed softly, his mouth full of contentment. He was a man in his 30s with a successful career and a beautiful wife at home. He seemed to lack nothing. Just like that, he slowly fell asleep. However, he still woke up at 5 o'clock. His stomach was ringing. Yi Mulin wanted to hold it in, but he couldn't. When he came out of the bathroom for the third time, his body was weak. He didn't have the same murderous spirit he had when he whipped Bai Shuali that night. He sat on the edge of the bed in his pajamas and pushed Bai Shuali. He called her name softly, Shuali, little white. She was still asleep. She turned around and hugged his arm. He stared at her, not sure if the little white she called was old Bai. Chapter 34-31. Mulin's face darkened as he pointed at his belly. The rice bug crawled over and pressed her little face against his lower abdomen. She listened and said, "You mean, I made you pregnant?" Mulin was so angry that he laughed. His anger towards her disappeared and he glared at her. "How did I get pregnant? I thought you were invincible," she said gloomily. Before she could ask again, he had already pulled her hair and pushed her to the side. He walked quickly to the bathroom. After a while, a rather spectacular sound came from inside. Bai Shuali stuck out her tongue, so her husband had diarrhea. She walked over barefoot and knocked on the door. "Elites also have diarrhea? I thought you guys wouldn't get sick." They had been married for a few months and he did not seem to have gotten sick. But now it was over. She did not know why, but she was quite happy to know that he would be weak and sick like her. His slightly hoarse voice came from inside. "Change your clothes and drive to the hospital later." "I drive?" She scratched her hair. "Didn't you say that I was a road killer?" "Shut up." He was a little annoyed and his temper was terrible. However, she felt that he was a little cute like this. She immediately went to change her clothes, although she was very sleepy. She took the car key. It was the white BMW that she used to catch the adulterer in the past. She came out neatly. Lawyer Yi also came out of the bathroom. His expression was indescribable. He looked at Bai Shuali and said in a low voice, "Let's go. Aren't you going to change your clothes?" She asked softly. His face darkened. "No need. Just take my wallet with you." Bai Shuali looked at him and ran to the changing room to get a windbreaker for him. She said, "It's cold outside and it's early in the morning." She yawned. "Men are so troublesome." He snorted. "Why didn't you say it was troublesome when you were comfortable last night?" She faked a smile. "Are you not comfortable? I remember that you were so comfortable that you kept sighing." He wanted to say something but held it back. His expression was indescribable. Bai Shuali was very happy. When she walked out, she said to Xiao Bai, "Xiao Bai, be good at home. I'll take Dad to the hospital." He followed slowly behind her. "When are you going to have a baby?" He couldn't keep raising a little tortoise like a child, right? Bai Shuali immediately supported him and said earnestly, "Look, I'm tired enough to take care of you. Are you sure you want to add another child to my burden?" Mulin looked sideways at her. "Bai Shuali, where's your face?" After saying that, he pinched her cheek. She immediately screamed, "It hurts! It hurts!" Only then did he let go of her, weakly leaning against her as they walked towards the elevator. When they finally got to the car, he didn't sit in the front but lay down in the back seat. His voice was also weak. "Drive slowly," she said with a kind face. "I'm afraid you won't be able to endure it." After saying that, he forcefully turned a family car into a sports car. Yi Mulin, the eldest son of the Yi family. His usually elegant face looked as if he had eaten xiang. Bai Shuali, slow down. He coughed lightly. She paused for a moment before saying, "You didn't agree when I asked you to slow down." His face was livid. Was she taking revenge? His face darkened. "If I'm fast, you'll feel comfortable. If you're so fast now, will I feel comfortable?" You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.